Chapter 16 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 16, A Summer in Boston. The Leveretts rejoiced heartily over Doris's good fortune. Aunt Priscilla began to trouble herself again about her will. She had taken the usual autumnal cold, but recovered from it with good nursing. Certainly Elizabeth Leverett was very kind. Aunt Priscilla had eased up on Betty while her mother spent a fortnight at Salem, helping with the fall sewing and making comfortables. And this time she brought home little Ruth, who was thin and peevish, and who had not gotten well over the measles that had affected her eyes badly. Ruth was past 4.
"I wish Mary did not take life so hard,"
said Mrs. Leverett with a sigh.
"They have been buying a new 20-acre pasture lot and 2 new cows, and it is just drive all the time. That poor little Elizabeth will be all worn out before she's grown up, and Ruth wouldn't have lived the winter through there."
Ruth was extremely troublesome at first, but grandmothers have a soothing art, and after a few weeks she began to improve. The visits of Doris fairly transported her, and she amused Grandpa by asking every morning if Doris would come today, having implicit faith in his knowledge of everything. Aunt Priscilla counted on the visits as well. She kept her room a good deal. Ruth's chatter disturbed her. Pattern children brought up on the strictest rules did not seem quite so agreeable to her as the little flower growing up in its own sweetness. Betty used to walk a short distance home with her, as she declared it was the only chance she had for a bit of Doris. She was very fond of hearing about the Royalls, and now Miss Isabel's engagement to Mr. Morris Winslow was announced. Warren declared Jane was quite top-loftical about it. She had been introduced to Miss Isabel at an evening company, and then they had met at Thayer's dry goods store, where she and Mrs. Chapman had been shopping, and had quite a little chat. They bowed in the street, and Jane was much pleased at the prospect of being indirectly related. But Betty had taken tea at Uncle Winthrop's with Miss Alice Royall, who had come over with the 2 little girls to return some of the visits Doris had made. The girls fell in love with bright, versatile Betty, and Alice was very much interested in her visit to Hartford, and thought her quite charming. Then it was quite fascinating to compare notes about Mr. Adams with one of his own kin. Alice made no secret of her admiration for him. The whole family joined in, for that matter. Young girls could be a little free and friendly with elderly gentlemen without exciting comment or having to be so precise. When Jane said,
"Cousin Morris told me such or such a thing,"
Betty was delighted to reply,
"Yes, Doris was speaking of it."
The girls were the best of friends, but this half-unconscious rivalry was natural. Mrs. Leverett had no objections to the intimacy now. Betty was older and more sensible. Now she was really a young lady receiving invitations, and going out to walk or shop with the girls. For hard as the times were, a little finery had to be bought, or a gown now and then. Mrs. King had not gone to New York, though her husband had been there on business. She would have been very glad of Betty's company, but with little Ruth and Aunt Priscilla, Betty felt she ought not to leave her mother. And then she was having a young girl's good time at home. Mrs. Leverett half wished Jane might fancy Warren. She was a smart, attractive, and withal sensible girl. But Warren was not thinking of girls just now, or of marrying. The debating society was a source of great interest, and nearly every talk turned on some aspect of the possible war. His singing class occupied him one evening, and one evening was devoted to dancing. He liked Jane very much in a friendly fashion, and they went on calling each other by their first names, but if he happened to drop in, there was almost sure to be other company. The sun on the business sign over the doorway gave him a great sense of responsibility, especially now when everything was so dull, and money, as people said, came like drawing teeth, a painful enough process in those days. Finally, Miss Isabel Royall's wedding day was set for early in June. The shopping was quite an undertaking. There were Thayer's dry goods store, and Daniel Simpson's and Mr. Bromfeld's, the greater and the lesser shops on Washington and School streets. It was quite a risk now ordering things from abroad, vessels being interfered with so much. But there were China silks and Canton crepe, a beautiful material, and French and English goods that escaped the enemy, so if you had the money you could find enough for an extensive wedding outfit. At home we had begun to make some very nice woolen goods. May came out full of bloom and beauty. Such a shower of blossoms from cherry, peach, pear, and apple would be difficult now to imagine, for almost every house had a yard or a garden. Colonnade Row was among the earliest places to be built up compactly of brick, and was considered very handsome for the time. But people strolled around then to see the beautiful unfolding of nature. There was the old Hancock house on Beacon Street. The old hero had gone his way, and his wife was now Madam Scott, and lived in the same house. And though the garden and nursery had been shorn of much of their glory, there were numerous foreign trees that were curiously beautiful, and people used to make at least one pilgrimage to see these immense mulberry trees in bloom. The old Bowden garden was another remarkable place, and the air around was sweet for weeks with the bloom of fruit trees, and later on the grapes that were raised in great profusion. You sometimes saw elegant old Madame Bowden walking up and down the garden paths, and the grandchildren skipping rope or playing tag. But Summer Street, with its crown of beauty, held its head as high as any of its neighbors.
I don't see why May should be considered unlucky for weddings.
Isabel protested.
I should like to be married in a bower of apple blossoms.
But isn't a bower of roses as beautiful?
And the snow of the cherries and pears? Think of it. Fragrant snow.
But Isabel gave parties to her friends, and they took tea out under the great apple tree and were snowed on with every soft wave of wind. It was not necessary then to go into seclusion. The bride-elect took pleasure in showing her gowns and her finery to her dearest friends. She was to be married in grandmother's brocade. Her own mother had lent it to her for the occasion. It was very handsome and could almost stand alone. There were great flowers that looked as if they were embroidered on it, and now it had assumed an ivory tint. 2 breadths had been taken out of the skirt. People were so slim at present, but the court train was left. The bertha, as we should call it now, was as a cobweb, and the lace from the puff sleeve falling over the arm of the same elegant material. It was good luck to borrow something to be married in, and good luck to have something old as well as the something new. Morris Winslow had been quite a beau about town. He was 30 now, 10 years older than Isabel. He had a big house over in Dorchester and almost a farm. He owned another in Boston, where a tavern of the higher sort was kept, and rooms rented to bachelors. He had an apartment here, and kept his servant Joe and his handsome team, besides his saddle horse. He was rather gay, but of good moral character. No one else would have been accepted as a lover at the Royalls. Jane was invited to one of the teas. People had not come to call in them dove parties yet, nor had breakfast or luncheon parties come in vogue for such occasions. There were about a dozen girls. They inspected the wedding outfit, they played graces, they sang songs, and had tea in Madame Royall's old china that had come to America almost 100 years before. Afterward several young gentlemen called, and they walked up and down in the moonlight. A young lady could invite her own escort, especially if she was keeping company. Sometimes the mothers sent a servant to fetch home their daughters. Of course Jane had an invitation to the wedding. Alice and a friend were to be bridesmaids, and the children were to be gowned in simple white muslin, with bows and streamers of pink satin ribbon, and strew roses in the bride's path. They were flower maidens. Dorcas Payne was asked, and Madame Royall begged Mr. Adams to allow his niece to join them. They would all take it as a great favor.
The idea!
Cried Aunt Priscilla.
And she no relation. If the Queen was to come to Boston, I dare say Doris Adams would be asked to turn out to meet her. Well, I hope her pretty face will never get her into trouble.
It was a beautiful wedding, everybody said. The great rooms and the halls were full of guests, but they kept a way open for the bride, who came downstairs on her lover's arm, and he looked very proud and manly. The bridesmaids and groomsmen stood one couple at each side. Little girls strewed their flowers and then stood in a circle, and the bride swept gracefully to the open space and turned to face the guests. The maid was a little excited when she pulled off the bride's glove, but all went well, and Isabel Royall was at her very best. When the kissing and congratulations were going on, 4 violins struck up melodious strains. It was just 6 o'clock then. The bride and groom stood for a while in the center of the room. then marched around and smiled and talked, and finally went out to the dining room, where the feast was spread, and where the bride had to cut the cake. Cary Adams was among the young people. He was a great favorite with Alice, and a welcome guest, if he did not come quite as often as his father. One of the prettiest things afterwards was the minuet dance by the 4 little girls, and after that 2 or 3 cotillions were formed. The bride danced with both of the groomsmen, and the new husband with both of the bridesmaids. Then their duty was done. They were to drive over to Dorchester that night, so presently they started. 2 or 3 old slippers were thrown for good luck. Several of the younger men were quite nonplussed at this arrangement, for they had planned some rather rough fun in the serenade, thinking the bridal couple would stay in town. There were some amusements, jesting and laughter, some card-playing, and health-drinking among the elders. The guests congratulated Madame Royall nearly as much as they had the bride. Then one after another came and bade her good night, and took away their parcel of wedding cake to dream on.
"Oh!"
cried Doris on the way home. The night was so pleasant they were walking.
"Oh, wasn't it splendid? I wish Betty could have been there. Cary, how old must you be before you can get married?"
Well, I should have to look up a girl.
"Oh, take Miss Alice. She likes you ever so much. I heard her say so. But you haven't any house like Mr. Winslow. Uncle Win, couldn't he bring her home to live with us?"
Cary's cheeks were in a red flame. Uncle Win laughed.
"My dear,"
he began,
"a young man must have some business or some money to take care of his wife. She wouldn't like to be dependent on his relatives. Cary is going to study law, which will take some years. Then he must get established, and so we will have to wait a long while. He is too young. Mr. Winslow is 30. Cary isn't 20 yet."
"Oh, dear. Well, perhaps Betty will get married. The girl doesn't have to be so old."
"No,"
said Uncle Win. Betty came over the next morning to spend the day and help Miss Recompense to distill. She wanted to hear the first account from Doris and Uncle Win, to take off the edge of Jane's triumphant news. They made rosewater and a concoction from the spiced pinks. Then they preserved cherries. Uncle Win took them driving toward night, and said some day they would go over to Dorchester. He had several friends there. The next excitement for Doris was the college commencement. Mr. Adams was disappointed that his son should not stand at the head of almost everything. He had taken one prize and made some excellent examinations, but there were many ranking as high and some higher. There were no ball games, no college regattas to share honors then. Not that these things were tabooed. There were some splendid rowing matches and games, but then young men had a desire to stand high intellectually. A long while before, Judge Sewell had expressed his disapproval of the excesses at dinners, the wine-drinking and conviviality, and had set Friday for commencement, so that there would be less time for frolicking. The war, with its long train of economies and the greater seriousness of life in general, had tempered all things, but there was gaiety enough now, with dinners given to the prize-winners and a very general jollification. Doris went with Uncle Winthrop. Commencement was one of the great occasions of the year. All the orations were in Latin, and the young men might have been haranguing a Roman army, so vigorous were they. Many of the graduates were very young. Boys really studied at that time. The remainder of the day and the one following were given over to festivities. Booths were everywhere on the ground, colors flying, flowers wreathed in every fashion, and so much merriment that they quite needed Judge Sewell back again to restrain the excesses. Mr. Adams and Doris went to dine at the Craigie house, and Doris would have felt quite lost among judges and professors but for Miss Craigie, who took her in charge. When they went home in the early evening, the shouts and songs and boisterousness seemed like a perfect orgy. Someone has said with a kind of dry wit, "Wherever an Englishman goes, courts and litigation are sure to prevail." Certainly our New England forefathers, who set out with the highest aims, soon found it necessary to establish law courts. In the early days every man pleaded his own cause, and was especially versed in the quirks of the law. Jeremy Gridley, a graduate of Harvard, interested himself in forming a law club in the early part of the previous century to pursue the study enough to keep out of the briars. and to Justice Dana is ascribed the credit of administering to Mr. Secretary Oliver, standing under the Liberty Tree in a great assemblage of angry townspeople, an oath that he would take no measures to enforce the odious Stamp Act of the British Parliament or distribute it among the people. And now the bar had a rank of its own, and Winthrop Adams had a strong desire to see his son one of the shining lights in the profession. Cary had a fine voice and was a good speaker. More than once he had distinguished himself in an argument at some of the debates. To be admitted to the office of Governor Gore was considered a high honor then, and this Mr. Adams gained for his son. Cary had another vague dream, but parental authority in well-bred families was not to be disputed at that period, and Cary acquiesced in his father's decision, since he knew his own must bring about much discussion and probably a refusal. Mrs. King came to visit her mother this summer. She left all her children at home, as she wanted to visit round, was afraid that they might be an annoyance to Aunt Priscilla. Little Ruth had gone home very much improved, her eyes quite restored. Uncle Winthrop enjoyed Mrs. King's society very much. She was intelligent and had cultivated her natural abilities. She also had a certain society suavity that made her an agreeable companion. Doris thought her a good deal like Betty. She was so pleasant and ready for all kinds of enjoyment. Aunt Priscilla considered her very frivolous, and there was so much going and coming that she wondered Elizabeth did not get crazy over it. They were to remove to New York in the fall, Mr. King having perfected his business arrangements, so Betty would have her winter in the gay city after all. There were many delightful excursions with pleasure parties up and down the bay. The embargo had been repealed, and the sails of merchant ships were again whitening the harbor, and business people breathed more freely. There were Castle Island, with its fortifications and its waving flag, and queer old dreary-looking Noddle's Island, also little towns and settlements where one could spend a day delightfully. Every place, it seemed to Doris, had some queer, interesting story, and she possessed an insatiable appetite for them. There was the great beautiful sweep of Boston Bay, with its inlets running around the towns and its green islands everywhere, places that had been famous and had suffered in the war, and were soon to suffer again. Mrs. King had a friend at Hingham, and one day they went there in a sort of family party. Uncle Winthrop obtained a carriage and drove them around. It was still famous for its woodenware factories, and Uncle Win said in the time of Governor Andros, when money was scarce among the early settlers, Hingham had paid his taxes in milk pails. But they decided the taxes could not have been very high, or the fame of the milk pails must have been very great. Mrs. Cary said in the early season forget-me-nots grew wild all about, and the ground was blue with them.
"Oh, Uncle Win, let us come and see them next year,"
cried Doris. Then they hunted up the old church that had been nearly rent asunder by the bringing in of a bass viol to assist the singers. Party spirit had run very high. The musical people had quoted the harps and sackbuts of King David's time, the trumpets and cymbals. At last the big bass viol won the victory and was there, and the hymn was, "Oh, may my heart in tune be found, like David's harp of solemn sound." But the old minister was not to be outdone. The hymn was lined off in this fashion: "Oh, may my heart go diddle diddle, like Uncle David's sacred fiddle." There were still a great many people opposed to instrumental music, and who could see no reverence in the organ's solemn sound. Uncle Winthrop smiled over the story, and Betty said it would do to tell to Aunt Priscilla. Betty begged that they might take Doris to Salem with them. Doris thought she should like to see the smart little Elizabeth, who was like a woman already, and her old playfellow James, as well as Ruth, who seemed to her hardly beyond babyhood. And there were all the weird old stories. She had read some of them in Cotton Mather's Magnalia, and begged others from Miss Recompense, who did not quite know whether she believed them or not, but she said emphatically that people had been mistaken, and there was no such thing as witches.
"A whole week?"
said Uncle Winthrop.
"Whatever shall I do without a little girl that length of time?"
"But you have Cary now,"
she returned archly. Cary was a good deal occupied with young friends and college associates. Now and then he went over to Charlestown and stayed all night with one of his chums.
I suppose I ought to learn how it will be without you, when you want to go away in real earnest.
I am never going away.
Suppose Mrs. King should invite you to New York. She has some little girls.
You might like to go.
She returned with a touch of hesitation.
To see the little girls?
Smilingly.
To see a great city. Do you suppose they are very queer? And Dutch?
He laughed at that.
But the Dutch people went there and settled, just as the Puritans came here. And I think I like the Dutch because they have such a merry time at Christmas. We read about them in history at school.
And then the English came, you know. I think now there is not much that would suggest Holland. I have been there.
Then Doris was eager to know what it was like, and Uncle Winthrop was interested in telling her. They forgot all about Salem, at least Doris did, until she was going to bed.
If you do go, you must be very careful a witch does not catch you, for I couldn't spare my little girl altogether.
Uncle Winthrop, I am going to stay with you always. When Miss Recompense gets real old and cannot look after things, I shall be your housekeeper.
When Miss Recompense reaches old age, I am afraid I shall be quaking for very fear.
But it takes a long while for people to get very old,
she returned decisively. Betty, going over the next day to tell her that they would start on Thursday morning, and were going in a sloop to Marblehead with a friend of her father's, Captain Morton. It was almost like going to sea, Doris thought. They had to thread their way through the islands and round Winthrop Head. There was Grover's Cliff, and then they went out past Nahant into the broad, beautiful bay, where you could see the ocean. It seemed ages ago since she had crossed it. They kept quite in to the green shores and could see Lynn and Swampscott. Then they rounded one more point and came to Marblehead, where Captain Morton stopped to unload his cargo, while they went on to Salem. At the old dock they were met by a big boy in a country wagon. This was Foster Manning, the eldest grandson of the family.
"Oh!"
cried Betty in amazement.
"How you have grown! It is Foster."
He smiled and blushed under the sunburn. A thin, angular boy, tall for his age, with rather large features and light brown hair with tawny streaks in it. But his gray-blue eyes were bright and honest-looking.
Yes,
Staring at the others, for he had at the moment forgotten his aunt's looks. Betty introduced them.
"I should not have known you,"
said Aunt Electa.
"but boys change a good deal in 2 years or so."
They were helped in the wagon, more by Betty than Foster, who was evidently very bashful. They drove up past the old courthouse, through the main part of town, which even then presented a thriving appearance with its home industries. But the seaport trade had been sadly interfered with by the rumors and apprehensions of war. At that time it was quaint and country-looking, with few pretensions to architectural beauty. There was old Gallows Hill at one end, with its haunting stories of witchcraft days. The irregular road wandered out to the farming districts. Many small towns had been set off from the original Salem in the century before, and the boundaries were marked mostly by the farms. Betty inquired after everybody, but most of the answers were,
"Yes,
and
no,
When they came in sight of the house, Mrs. Manning and little Ruth ran out to welcome the guests, followed by Elizabeth, who was almost as good as a woman. The house itself was a plain 2-story, with a hall door in the middle and a window on each side. The roof had a rather steep pitch in front with overhanging eaves. From this pitch it wandered off in a slow curve at the back, and seemed stretched out to cover the kitchen and the sheds. The grassy plot in front was divided by a trodden path. On one side of the small stoop was a great patch of hollyhocks that were tolerated because they needed no special care. Mrs. Manning had no time to waste upon flowers. The aspect was neat enough, but rather dreary as Doris contrasted it with the bloom at home. But the greetings were cordial. Only Mrs. Manning asked Betty
if she had been waiting for someone to come and show her the way.
Ruth ran to Doris at once and caught her round the waist, nestling her head fondly on the bosom of the guest. Elizabeth stood awkwardly distant, and only stared when Betty presented her to Doris. They were ushered into the first room, which was the guest chamber. The floor was painted, and in summer the rugs were put away. A large bedstead with faded chintz hangings, a bureau, a table, and 2 chairs completed the furniture. The ornaments were 2 brass candlesticks and a snuffer's tray on the high mantel. Here they took off their hats and laid down their budgets, and then went through to Mother's room, where there were a bed and a cradle, a bureau, a big chest, a table piled up with work, a smaller candle stand, and a curious old desk. Next to this was the living room, where the main work of life went on. Beyond this were a kitchen and some sheds. Baby Hester sat on the floor and looked amazed at the eruption, then began to whimper. Her mother hushed her up sharply, and she crept out to the living room.
"We may as well all go out,"
said Mrs. Manning.
"I must see about supper, for that creature we have doesn't know when the kettle boils."
And she led the way. Elizabeth began to spread the tea table. A youngish woman was working in the kitchen. The Mannings had taken one of the town's poor, who at this period were farmed out. Sarah Lewis was not mentally bright, and required close watching, which she certainly received at the Mannings. Doris stood by the window with Ruth until the baby cried, when her mother told her to take Hester out into the kitchen and give her some supper and put her to bed. And then Doris could do nothing but watch Elizabeth while the elders discussed family affairs. The conversation a good deal interrupted by rather sharp orders to Sarah in the kitchen, and some not quite so sharp to Elizabeth. Supper was all on the table when the men came in. There were Mr. Manning, Foster, and James, and 2 hired men.
"You must wait, James,"
said his mother.
"You and Elizabeth."
The guests were ranged at one end of the table, the hired man and Foster at the other. Elizabeth took some knitting and sat down by the window. The 2 younger children remained in the kitchen. Doris was curiously interested, though she felt a little strange. Her eyes wandered to Elizabeth, and met the other eyes as curious as hers. Elizabeth had straight light brown hair, cut square across the neck, and across her forehead in what we should call a bang.
"It was time to let it grow long,"
her mother admitted.
"But it was such a bother falling in her eyes."
Her frock, whatever color it had been, was now faded to a hopeless, depressing gray, and her brown gingham apron tied at the waist betrayed the result of many washings. She was thin and pale, too, and tired-looking. Times had not been good, and some of the crops were not turning out well, so every nerve had to be strained to pay for the new lot, in order that the interest on the amount should not eat up everything. Afterward the men went to look to the cattle, and Mrs. Manning, when she had given orders a while in the kitchen, took her guests out on the front porch. She sat and knit as she talked to them, as the moon was shining and gave her light enough to see. When the old clock struck 9, Mr. Manning came through the hall and stood in the doorway.
"Be you going to sit up all night, Mother?" he inquired.
"Dear, no. And I expect you're all tired. We're up so early in the morning here that we go to bed early. And I was thinking, Ruth needn't have gone upstairs, and Doris could have slept with Elizabeth."
"I'll go upstairs with Doris, and Lecty may have the room to herself,"
exclaimed Betty. Grandmother Manning had a room downstairs, back of the parlor, and one of the large rooms upstairs that the family had the privilege of using, though it was stored nearly full with a motley collection of articles and furniture. This was her right in the house left by her husband, but she spent most of her time between her daughter at Danvers and another in the heart of town, where there were neighbors to look at, if nothing else. Doris peered in the corners of the room by the dim candlelight.
"It's very queer,"
she said with a half-smile at Betty, glancing around, for there were lines across on which hung clothes and bags of dried herbs that gave the room an aromatic fragrance, and parcels in one corner piled up against the wall. But the space to the bed was clear, and there were a stand for the candle and 2 chairs.
"The children are in the next room, and the boys and men sleep at the back. The other rooms have sloping roofs. And then there's a queer little garret. Grandmother Manning is real old, and sometime Mary will have all the house to herself. Josiah bought out his sister's share, and Mrs. Manning's runs only as long as she lives."
"I shouldn't want to sleep with Elizabeth. I love you, Betty."
Betty laughed wholesomely.
"You will get acquainted with her tomorrow,"
she said. Doris laid awake some time, wondering if she really liked visiting, and recalling the delightful Christmas visit at Uncle Winthrop's. The indefinable something that she came to understand was not only leisure and refinement, but the certain harmonious satisfactions that make up the keynote of life from whence melody suffuses itself were wanting here. They had their breakfast by themselves the next morning. Friday was a busy day, but all the household, except the baby, were astir at 5, and often earlier. There were churning and the working of butter and packing it down for customers. Of course, June butter had the royal mark, but there were plenty of people glad to get any grass butter. Betty took Doris out for a walk and to show her what a farm was like. There was the herd of cows, and in the field by themselves, the young ones from 3 months to a year. There were 2 pretty colts Mr. Manning was raising, and there was a flock of sheep on a stony pasture lot, with some long-legged, awkward-looking lambs who had outgrown their babyhood. Then they espied James weeding out the garden beds. Betty sat down on a stone at the edge of the fence and took out some needlework she carried around in her pocket. Doris stood patting down the soft earth with her foot.
"Do you like to do that?"
she asked presently.
"No, I don't,"
in a short tone.
"I think I should not either."
"'Tain't the things you like, it's what has to be done,"
the boy flung out impatiently.
"I'm not going to be a farmer, I just hate it. When I'm big enough, I'm coming to Boston."
"When will you be big enough?"
"Well, when I'm 21. You're of age then, you see, and your own master. But I might run away before that. Don't tell anyone that, Doris. You Hucker, I don't have to spend time at Grandmother's that winter. I wish I could just live there always. And Grandpop is the nicest man I know. I just hate a farm."
Doris felt very sorry for him. She thought she would not like to work that way with her bare hands. Miss Recompense always wore gloves when she gardened.
"I'd like to be you, with nothing to do."
That was a great omission. The winter at Uncle Leverett's he had rather despised girls. Cousin Sam was the one to be envied then, and it seemed to her that she kept quite busy at home, but it was a pleasant kind of business. She did not see Elizabeth until dinner time. James took the men's dinner out to the field. They could not spend the time to come in, and after dinner Betty harnessed the old mare Ginny and took Electa, Doris, and little Ruth out driving. The sun had gone under a cloud and the breeze was blowing out from the ocean. Electa chose to see the old town, even if there were but few changes and trade had fallen off. Several slender-masted merchantmen were lying idly at the quays, half afraid to venture with a cargo, lest they might fall into the hands of privateers. The stores, too, had a depressed aspect. Men sat outside gossiping in a languid sort of way, and here and there a woman was tending her baby on the porch or doing a bit of sewing.
"What a sleepy old place,"
said Mrs. King.
"It would drive me to distraction."
End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 17. Another Girl. Saturday afternoon the work was finished up and the children washed. The supper was eaten early, and at sundown the Sabbath had begun. The parlor was open, but the children were allowed out on the porch. Ruth sprang up a time or two rather impatiently.
"Sit still,"
said Elizabeth,
"or you will have to go to bed at once."
"Couldn't I take her a little walk?"
asked Doris.
"A walk? Why, it is part of a Sunday."
"But I walk on Sunday with Uncle Winthrop."
"It's very wicked. We do walk to church, but that isn't anything for pleasure."
"But Uncle thinks one ought to be happy and joyous on Sunday. It is the day the Lord rose from the dead."
"It's the Sabbath, and you are to remember the Sabbath to keep it holy."
"What is the difference between Sabbath and Sunday?"
"There ain't any,"
said James.
"There's 6 days to work, and I wish there was 2 Sundays, one in the middle of the week. The best time of all is Sunday night. You don't have to keep so very still, and you don't have to work neither."
Elizabeth sighed. Then she said severely,
"Do you know your catechism, James?"
"Well, I always have to study at Sunday morning,"
was the rather sullen reply.
"Maybe you had better go in and look it over."
"You never do want a fellow to take any comfort." "Yes, I know it."
"Ruth, if you are getting sleepy, go to bed."
Ruth had leaned her head down on Doris's shoulder.
"She's wide awake."
And Doris gave her a little squeeze that made her smile. She would have laughed outright but for fear. Elizabeth leaned her head against the door jamb.
You look so tired,
said Doris pityingly.
I am tired through and through. I am always glad to have Saturday night come, and no knitting or anything. Don't you knit when you are at home?
I haven't knit much.
Doris flushed up to the roots of her fair hair, remembering her unfortunate attempts at achieving a stocking.
What do you do?
Study and read to Uncle Winthrop, and go to school and to writing school, and walk and take little journeys and drives and do drawing. Next year I shall learn to paint flowers.
But you do some kind of work.
I keep my room in order, and Uncle Win trusts me to dust his books, and I sew a little and make lace. But you see, there's Miss Recompense and Dinah and Cato.
Oh, what a lot of help. What does Mrs. Recompense do?
She is the housekeeper.
Is Uncle Winthrop very rich?
I don't know.
But there are no children and boys to wear out their clothes in stockings. There's so much knitting to be done. I go to school in winter, but there is too much work in summer. Doris Adams, you are a lucky girl if your fortune doesn't spoil you.
Fortune?
Exclaimed Doris in surprise.
Yes, I heard Father talk about it, and all that from England. Then someone died in Boston and left you ever so much. I suppose you will be a grand lady.
I'd love to be a lovely old lady like Madame Royall.
And who is she?
Doris was in the full tide of narration when Mrs. Manning came to the hall door. She caught some description of a party.
Elizabeth, put Ruth to bed at once, and go yourself. Doris, talking of parties isn't a very good preparation for the Sabbath. Elizabeth, when you say your prayers, think of your sins and shortcomings for the week, and repent of them earnestly.
Ruth had fallen asleep, and gave a little whine. Her mother slapped her.
Hush, not a word. You deserve the same and more, Elizabeth. James, go in and study your catechism over 3 times, then go to bed.
Doris sat alone on the doorstep, confused and amazed. She was quite sure now she did not like Mrs. Manning, and she felt very sorry for Elizabeth. Then Betty came out and told her some odd Salem stories. They all went to church Sabbath morning in the old Puritan parlance. Doris found it hard to comprehend the sermon. Many of the people from the farms brought their luncheons, and wandered about the graveyard or sat under the shady trees. At 2, the children were catechized. At 3, service began again. Mrs. King took Doris and Betty to dine with a friend of her youth, and then went back to the service, out of respect to her sister and brother-in-law. Little Ruth fell asleep, and was punished for it when she reached home. The children were all fractious, and their mother scolded. When the sun went down, there was a general sense of relief. The younger ones began to wander around. The 2 mothers sauntered off together, talking matters they preferred not to have fall on the ears of small listeners. Betty attracted the boys. Foster could talk to her, though he was much afraid of girls in general. Doris and Elizabeth sat on the steps. Ruth was running small races with herself.
Would you rather go and walk?
Inquired Elizabeth timidly.
Oh, no, not if you like to sit still.
Cheerfully.
I just do. I'm always tired. You are so pretty. I was afraid of you at first, and you have such beautiful clothes. That blue ribbon on your hat is like a bit of the sky, and God made the sky.
The voice died away in admiration.
That isn't my best hat,
returned Doris simply.
Cousin Betty thought the damp of the ocean and running out in the dust would ruin it. It has some beautiful pink roses and ever so much gauzy stuff and a great bow of pink satin. Then I have a pink muslin frock with tiny green and brown sprigs all over it, and a great sash of the muslin that comes down to the hem. The Chapman girls have satin ribbon sashes, but Miss Recompense said she liked the muslin better.
Do you have to wear just what she says?
Oh, no. Madame Royall chooses some things, and Betty. And Cousin King brought me an elegant sash, white, with flowers all over it. I have ever so many pretty things.
Oh, how proud you must feel,
said the Puritan maid half enviously.
I don't know.
Hesitatingly.
I think I feel just nice, and that is all there is about it. Uncle Win likes what they get for me. Men can't buy clothes, you know, and if he is pleased and thinks I look well, that is the end of it.
Oh, how good it must feel to be happy just like that. But are you quite sure,
lowering her voice to a touch of awe,
that you will not be punished in the next world?
What for? Doesn't God mean us to be happy?
Well, not in this world, perhaps,
answered the young theologian.
But you don't have anything in heaven except a white robe, and if you haven't any pretty things in this world...
I wish I could give you some of mine.
Doris slipped her soft, warm hand over the other, beginning to grow bony and strained already.
They wouldn't do me any good,
was the almost apathetical reply.
I only go to church, and Mother wouldn't let me wear them.
Do you like to go to church?
I hate the long sermons and the prayers. Oh, that is dreadful wicked, isn't it? But I like to see the people and hear the talk, and they do have some new clothes, and the sitting still. When you've run and run all the week and are tired all over, it's just good to sit still. And it's different. I get so tired of the same things all the time and the hurry. Do you know what I'm going to do when I am a woman?
No,
replied Doris with a look of interested inquiry.
I'm going to have one room like Grandmother Manning and live by myself. I shan't have any husband or children. I don't want to be sewing and knitting and patching continually, and babies are an awful sight of trouble, and husbands are just thinking of work all the time. Then I shall go visiting when I like, and though I shall read the Bible, I won't mind about remembering the sermons. I'll just have a good time by myself.
Doris felt strangely puzzled. She always wanted a good time with someone. The great pleasure to her was having another share a joy, and to live alone was almost like being imprisoned in some dreary cell. Neither could she think of Helen or Eudora living alone, indeed any of the girls she knew.
Now you can go on about the wedding party,
said Elizabeth after a pause.
And you really danced, and you were not afraid the ground would open and swallow you?
Why, no,
returned Doris.
There are earthquakes that swallow up whole towns, but, you see, the good and the bad go together. And I never heard of anyone being swallowed up.
Why, yes, in the Bible, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram.
But they were not dancing. I think,
hesitatingly,
they were finding fault with Moses and Aaron and wanting to be leaders in some manner.
Well, I am glad it wasn't dancing. And now, go on quick before they come back.
Elizabeth had never read a fairy story or any vivid description. She had no time, and there were no books of that kind about the house. She fairly revelled in Doris's brilliant narrative. She had seen one middle-aged couple stand up to be married after the Sunday afternoon service, and she heard of 2 or 3 younger people being married with a kind of wedding supper. But that Doris should have witnessed all this herself, that she should have worn a wedding gown and scattered flowers before the bride. Ruth was tired of running.
I'm sleepy,
she said.
Unfasten my dress. I want to go to bed.
Betty and the boys were coming up the path, with the shadowy forms of the grown people behind them. Mr. Manning had been taking a nap on the rude kitchen settee, his Sunday evening indulgence. Now he came through the hall.
Boys, children, it's time to go to bed. You're all sleepy enough in the morning, but you would sit up half the night if someone did not drive you off.
Oh, I wish you lived here, Aunt Betty,
said Foster for a good night. Betty and Doris were almost ready for bed when there was a little sound at the door, pushed open by Elizabeth, who stood there in her plain scant nightgown with a distraught expression, as if she had seen a ghost.
Oh, Aunt Betty or Doris, can you remember the text and what the sermon was about? We always say it to Mother after tea Sabbath evening, and she'll be sure to ask me tomorrow morning, and I can't think. I never scarcely do forget. Oh, what shall I do?
Her distress was so genuine that Betty folded her in her arms. Elizabeth began to cry at the tender touch.
There, little Bessie, don't cry. Let me see. I remember I was preaching another sermon to myself. It was, Do this, and ye shall live. And instead of all the hard things he put in, I thought of the kindly things Father was always doing, and Uncle Win and Mother, and the pleasant things instead of the severe laws. And when he reached his lastly, he said no one could keep all the laws, and because they could not, the Savior came and died. But he seemed to preach as if the old laws were still in force, and that the Savior's death really had not changed anything. That was in the morning. In the afternoon was the miracle of the loaves and fishes.
Yes, I could recall that. But I was sure Mother would ask me the one I had forgotten. It always happens that way. Oh, I'm so glad. Dear Aunt Betty. And if I was sometimes called Bessie, as you called me just now, or Betty, or anything besides the everlasting Lizbeth, oh, Doris, how happy you must be.
There, dear,
said Betty soothingly.
Don't cry so. I will write out what I can recall on a slip of paper, and you can look it over in the morning. I just wish you would come and make me a visit and go over to Uncle Win's. Yes, Doris is a happy little girl.
But I have everything in the world,
said Doris with a long breath.
I'm afraid I could not be so happy here. Oh, can't we take Elizabeth home with us? Betty, coax her mother.
It wouldn't do a bit of good. You can't coax Mother. And there's always so much work in the summer. I'm afraid she wouldn't like it, even if you asked her.
But James came, and little Ruth.
They were too young to work. Oh, it would be like going to heaven.
It may be sometime, little Bessie. You can dream over it.
Good night. Would you kiss me, Doris?
The happy girl kissed her 12 times instead of once, but her deep eyes were full of tears as she turned to Betty when the small figure had slipped away.
Yes, it is a hard life,
said Betty.
It seems as if children's lives ought to be happier. I don't know what makes Mary so hard. I'm sure she does not get it from Father or Mother. She appears to think all the virtue of the world lies in work. I wonder what such people will do in heaven.
Oh, Betty, do try to have her come to Boston. I know Uncle Win will feel sorry for her.
Those years in the early part of the century were not happy ones for childhood in general. Too much happiness was considered demoralizing in this world, and a poor preparation for the next. Work was the great panacea for all sorts of evils. It was seldom work for one's neighbors, though people were ready to go in sickness and trouble. It was adding field to field and interest to interest to strive and save and wear oneself out and die. Elizabeth was up betimes the next morning, and there lay the paper with chapter and verse and some remarks. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she ran downstairs. Sarah had made the shed fire, and the big wash kettle had been put over it. She was rubbing out the first clothes, the nicest pieces.
"Now fly round, Lisbeth,"
said her mother.
"You've dawdled enough these few days back, and there'll be an account to settle presently. I suppose your head was so full of that bunch of vanity you never remembered a word of the sermon yesterday. What was the text in the morning?"
Elizabeth's pale face turned scarlet, and her lip quivered. Her slight frame seemed to shrink a moment. Then, in a gasping sort of way, she gave chapter and verse and repeated the words.
"I don't think that was it,"
said her mother sharply.
"Ruth was in a fidget just as the text was given out. Wasn't that last Sunday's text?"
"Some of the others may remember,"
the child said in her usual apathetical voice.
"Well, you needn't act as if you are going to have a hysteric. Hand me that dish of beans. Your father likes them warmed over. Quick, there he comes now. You stir them."
A trivet stood on the glowing coals, and the pan soon warmed through. Father and the men took their places. Foster came in sleepily.
"Where's James?"
inquired his mother.
"I don't want him in the field today. He can read in the garden. You send him with the dinners."
"Where was yesterday morning's text, Foster?"
Mrs. Manning asked sharply. The boy looked up blankly. As there was no Sunday evening examination, it had slipped out of his mind.
"It was something about keeping the law doing."
James entered at that moment and had heard the question and hesitating reply.
"I can't remember chapter and verse, but it was short, and I just rammed the words down on my memory box. Do this, and ye shall live."
"James, no such irreverence,"
exclaimed his father. Elizabeth in the kitchen drew a long breath of relief. She wondered whether his mother would have taken Aunt Betty's word. Monday morning was always a hard time. Sarah required looking after, for her memory lapses were frequent. Mr. Manning said a good birch switch was the best remedy he knew. But though 100 years before people had thought nothing of whipping their servants, public opinion was against it now. Mrs. Manning did sometimes box her ears when she was overmuch tired, but she was a very faithful worker. Elizabeth gave Ruth and baby Hester their breakfast. Then Betty came down and insisted upon getting the next breakfast while Mrs. Manning hung up her first clothes. She had been scolding to Betty about people having no thought or care as to how they put back the work with their late breakfast. But when Betty cooked and served it, and insisted upon washing up the dishes, and Doris amused the baby, who was not well, and helped Ruth shell the peas for dinner, when the washing and churning were out of the way long before noon, and Elizabeth was folding down the clothes for ironing, while Sarah and her mother prepared the dinner and sent it out to the men, the child couldn't see that things were at all behindhand. Sarah and Elizabeth ironed in the afternoon. Mrs. Manning brought out her sewing, and Betty helped on some frocks for the children. 2 old neighbors came in to supper, bringing 2 little girls who were wonderfully attracted by Doris, and delighted to be amused in quite a new fashion. But Elizabeth was too busy to be spared. After supper was cleared away and the visitors had gone, Elizabeth brought her knitting and sat on the stoop step in the moonlight.
"Oh, don't knit,"
cried Doris.
"You look so tired."
"I'd like to go to bed this minute,"
said the child.
"But last week I fell behind. You see, there are so many to wear stockings, and the boys do rattle them out so fast. We try to get most of the new knitting done in the summer, for autumn brings so much work. And if you will talk to me, I like so to hear about Boston, and Madame Royall's beautiful house, and your Uncle Win. It must be like reading some interesting book. Oh, I wish I could come and stay a whole week with you."
"A week?"
Doris laughed.
"Why, you couldn't see it all in a month or a year. Every day I am finding something new about Boston, and Miss Recompense remembers so many queer stories. I'm going to tell her all about you. I know she'll be real nice about your coming. Everything is as Uncle Win says, but he always asks her."
Doris could make her little descriptions very vivid and attractive. At first Elizabeth replied by exclamations. Then there was quite a silence. Doris looked at her. She was leaning against the post of the porch, and her needles no longer clicked, though she held the stocking in its place. The poor child had fallen fast asleep. The moonlight made her look so ghostly pale that at first Doris was startled. The 3 ladies came out, but Elizabeth never stirred. When her mother spied her, she shook her sharply by the shoulder.
"Poor child!"
exclaimed Mrs. King.
"Elizabeth, put up your work and go to bed."
"If you are too sleepy to knit, put up your work and go out and eat on the bread a spell. Sarah always gets it lumpy if you don't watch her,"
said Mrs. Manning. Elizabeth gathered up her ball and went without a word.
"I'll knit for you,"
said Betty, intercepting her and taking the work.
"Mary, you will kill that child presently, and when you have buried her, I hope you will be satisfied to give Ruth a chance for her life,"
exclaimed Mrs. King indignantly.
"I can't afford to bring my children up in idleness, and if I could, I hope I have too great a sense of responsibility and my duty toward them. I was trained to work, and have been thankful many a time that I didn't have to waste grown-up years in learning."
"We didn't work like that. Then father had given up some years to his country, and we were poor. You have no need, and it is cruel to make such a slave of a child. She does a woman's work."
"I am quite capable of governing my own family, Electa, and I think I know what is best and right for them. We can't afford to bring up fine ladies and teach them French and other trumpery. If Elizabeth is fitted for a plain farmer's wife, that is all I ask. She won't be likely to marry a president or a foreign lord, and if we have a few $100 to start her in life, maybe she won't object."
"You had better give her a little comfort now, instead of adding farm to farm, and saving up so much for the women who will come in here when you are dead and gone. Think of the men who have 2nd and 3rd wives, and whose children are often turned adrift to look out for themselves. Hundreds of poor women are living hard and joyless lives just to save up money. And it is a shame to grind their children to the lowest ebb.
Mrs. Manning was very angry. She had no argument at hand, so she turned in an arrogant manner and said austerely,
I had better go and look after my daughter to see that she doesn't work herself quite to death. But I don't know what we should do without bread.
Now you have done it,
cried Betty.
I only hope she won't vent her anger on the poor child.
It is a curious thing,
said Mrs. King reflectively,
that women, well, men too, make such a point of church going on Sunday, and hardly allow the poor children to draw a comfortable breath, and on Monday act like fiends. Women especially seem to think they have a right to indulge in dreadful tempers on washing day, and drive all before them. Think of the work that has been done in this house today, and the picture of Elizabeth, worn out, falling asleep over her knitting. I should have sent her to bed with the chickens. I'd like to take her home with me, but it would spoil her for the farm.
Betty knit away on the stocking.
I can't see what makes Mary so hard and grasping,
she said.
It troubles Mother a good deal.
When they went in, the house was quiet and the kitchen dark. Mrs. Manning sat sewing. Their candles were on the table. Betty and Mrs. King said a cordial good night. The sisters-in-law were to come the next day, and Grandmother Manning, with an addition of 4 children. The Salem sister, Mrs. Gates, was stout and pleasant, the farmer's sister thin and with a troublesome cough, and she had a young baby besides her little girl of 6. She was to make a visit in Salem and doctor somewhat, to see if she could not get over her cough before cold weather. The children were turned out of doors on the grassy roadside, where they couldn't hurt anything. Mrs. Gates and Betty helped in the kitchen, and after the dinner was cleared away, Elizabeth was allowed to put on her second-best gingham and go out with the children. They ran and played and screamed and laughed.
I'd 100 times rather sit still and hear you talk,
she said to Doris.
And I'm awful sorry to have you go tomorrow. Even when I am busy, it is so nice just to look at you, with your beautiful hair and your dark eyes, and your skin that is like velvet and doesn't seem to tan or freckle. Foster hates freckles so.
Doris flushed at the compliment.
I wonder how it would seem to be as pretty as you are. And you're not a bit set up about your fine clothes and all. I suppose when you're born that way, you're so used to it, and there ain't anything to wish for. I'm so glad you could come, and I do hope you will come again.
They parted very good friends. Mrs. King had been quite generous to the small people, and Mrs. Manning really loved her sister, though she considered her very lax and extravagant. No one could tell what was before him, and thrift and prudence were the great virtues of those days. True, they often degenerated into penuriousness, and labor that was early and late, so severe, indeed, it cost many a life, and the people who came after reaped the benefit. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 18. Winter and Sorrow.
Oh, Uncle Win,
exclaimed Doris.
I can't be sorry that I went to Salem, and I've had a queer, delightful time seeing so many strange things and hearing stories about them. But I am very, very glad to get back to Boston, and gladdest of all to be your little girl. There isn't anybody in the whole wide world I'd change you for.
Her arms were about him. He was so tall that she could not quite reach up to his neck when he stood straight, but he had a way of bending over, and she was growing, and the clasp gave him a thrill of exquisite pleasure.
I've missed my little girl a great deal,
he said.
I am afraid I shall never want you to go away again.
The next time you must go with me, though Betty was delightful, and Mrs. King is just splendid.
They had famous talks about Salem afterward, and the little towns around. Miss Recompense said now she shouldn't know how to live without a child in the house. Mrs. King went home to her husband and little ones, and Doris imagined the joy in greeting such a fond mother. Uncle Win half promised he would visit New York sometime. Even Aunt Priscilla was pleased when Doris came up to Sudbury Street, and wanted her full share of every visit. And they were all amazed when she went over to Uncle Win's to spend a day, and was very cordial with Miss Recompense. They had a nice chat about the old times, and the Salem witches, and the dead and gone governors, even Governor and Lady Gage, who had been very gay in her day, and both women had seen her riding about in her elegant carriage, often with a handsome young girl at her side. She had some business, too, with Uncle Win. They were in a study a long while together.
"Living with the Leverett has certainly changed Aunt Priscilla very much,"
he said later in the evening to Miss Recompense.
"I begin to think it is not good for people to live so much alone when they are going down the shady side of life. Or perhaps it would not be so shady if they would allow a little sun to shine in it."
Solomon was full of purring content, and growing lazier every day. Latterly he had courted Uncle Win's society. There was a wide ledge in one of the southern windows, and Doris made a cushion to fit one end. He loved to lie here and bask in the sunshine. When there was a fire on the hearth, he had another cushion in the corner. Sometimes he sauntered around and interviewed the books quite as if he was aware of their contents. He considered that he had a supreme right to Doris's lap, and he sometimes had half a mind to spring up on Uncle Win's knee, but the invitation did not seem sufficiently pressing. Cary was at home regularly now, except that he spent one night every week with a friend at Charleston, and went frequently to the Craigies to meet some of his old chums. He had not appeared to care much for Doris at first, and she was rather shy. Latterly they had become quite friends. But it seemed to Doris that he was so much gayer and brighter at Madame Royall's, where he certainly was a great favourite. Miss Alice was very brilliant and charming. They were always having hosts of company. Mr. and Mrs. Winslow were at the head of one circle in society. In this autumn Miss Jane Morse was married and went to live in Chaffee Street, in handsome style. She had done very well indeed. Betty was one of the bridesmaids, and wore a white India silk in which she looked quite a beauty. Miss Helen Chapman was transferred to Miss Rowson's school to be finished. Doris and Eudora still attended Miss Parker's, but Madame Royall had treated the girls to the new instrument coming into vogue, the pianoforte. Its tone was so much richer and deeper than the old spinet. She liked it very much herself. Doris was quite wild over it. Madame Royall begged that she might be allowed to take lessons on it with the girls. Uncle Winthrop said in a year or two she might have one if she liked it and could learn to play. She and Betty used to talk about Elizabeth Manning. There was a new baby now, another little boy. Mrs. Leverett made a visit and brought home Hester to ease up things for the winter. Elizabeth couldn't go to school any more. There was so much to do. She wrote Doris quite a long letter and sent it by grandmother. Postage was high then, and people did not write much for pure pleasure. And just before the New Year, when Betty was planning to go to New York for her visit to Mrs. King, a great sorrow came to all of them. Uncle Leverett had not seemed well all the fall, though he was for the most part his usual happy self, but business anxieties pressed deeply upon him and Warren. He used to drop in now and then and take tea with Cousin Winthrop, and as they sat round the cheerful fire, Doris would bring her stool to his side and slip her hand in his as she had that first winter. She was growing tall quite rapidly now, and pretty by the minute, Uncle Leverett said. There was no end of disquieting rumors. American shipping was greatly interfered with, and American seamen impressed aboard British ships by the hundreds, often to desert at the first opportunity. Merchantmen were deprived of the best of their crews for the British Navy, as that country was carrying on several wars, and now Wellington had gone to the assistance of the Spanish, and all Europe was trying to break the power of Napoleon, who had set out since the birth of his son, now crowned King of Rome, to subdue all the nations. The Leopard Chesapeake affair had nearly plunged us into war, but it was promptly disavowed by the British government and some indemnity paid. There was a powerful sentiment opposed to war in New York and New England, but the people were becoming much inflamed under repeated outrages. Young men were training in companies and studying up naval matters. The country had so few ships then that to rush into a struggle was considered madness. Mr. Winthrop Adams was among those bitterly opposed to war. Cary was strongly imbued with a young man's patriotic enthusiasm. There was a good deal of talk at Madame Royall's, and a young lieutenant had been quite a frequent visitor, and was an admirer also of the fair Alice. Then Alfred Barron, his friend at Charleston, had entered the naval service. Studying law seemed dry and tiresome to the young fellow when such stirring events were happening on every side. Uncle Leverett took a hard cold early in the new year. He was indoors several days, then some business difficulties seemed to demand his attention, and he went out again. A fever set in, and though at first it did not appear serious, after a week the doctor began to look very grave. Betty stopped her preparations and wrote a rather apprehensive letter to Mrs. King. One day Uncle Win was sent for, and remained all the afternoon and evening. The next morning he went down to the store.
"I'm afraid father's worse,"
said Warren.
"His fever was very high through the night, and he was flighty, and now he seems to be in a sort of stupor, with a very feeble pulse. Oh, Uncle Win, I haven't once thought of his dying, and now I'm awfully afraid. Business is in such a dreadful way. That has worried him."
Mr. Adams went up to Sudbury Street at once. The doctor was there.
"There has been a great change since yesterday,"
he said gravely.
"We must prepare for the worst. It has taken me by surprise, for he bid fair to pull through."
Alas, the fears were only too true. By night they had given up hope and watched tearfully for the next 24 hours, when the kindly upright life that had blessed so many went to its own reward. To Doris it seemed incredible. That poor Miss Henrietta Maria should slip out of life was only a release, and that Miss Arabella and the ripeness of age should follow had awakened in her heart no real sorrow, but a gentle sense of their having gained something in another world. But Uncle Leverett had so much here, so many to love him and to need him. Death, the mystery to all of us, is doubly so to the young. When Doris looked on Uncle Leverett's placid face, she was very sure he could not be really gone, but mysteriously asleep. Yes, little Doris, the active, loving, thinking man, had fallen on sleep, and the soul had gone to its reward. Foster Leverett had been very much respected, and there were many friends to follow him to his grave in the old granary burying ground, where the Fosters and Leveretts rested from their labors. There on the walk stood the narrow row of elms that Captain Adino Paddock had imported from England a dozen years before the Revolutionary War broke out, in their very pride of strength and grandeur now, even if they were leafless. It seemed very hard and cruel to leave him here in the bleakness of midwinter, Doris thought, and he was not really dead to her until the bearers turned away with empty hands, and the friends with sorrowful greeting passed out of the enclosure and left him alone to the coming evening and the requiem of the wind soughing through the trees. Doris sat by Mrs. Recompense that evening with Solomon on her lap. She could not study. She did not want to read or sew or make lace. Uncle Winthrop had gone to Sudbury Street. All the family were to be there. The Kings had come from New York and the Mannings from Salem.
"Oh,"
said Doris after a long silence.
"How can Aunt Elizabeth live, and Betty and Warren, when they cannot see Uncle Leverett any more? And there are so many things to talk about, only they can never ask him any questions. And he was so comforting. He was the first one that came to me on the vessel, you know, and he said to Captain Greer, 'Have you a little girl who has come from Old Boston to New Boston?' Then he put his arm around me, and I liked him right away. And the great fire in the hall was so lovely. I liked everybody but Aunt Priscilla, and now I feel sorry for her and like her a good deal. Sometimes she gets queer and what she calls pudgiky, but she is real good to Betty."
"She's a sensible, clear-headed woman, and she has good solid principles. I do suppose we all get a little queer. I can see it in myself."
"Oh, dear Miss Recompense, you are not queer,"
protested Doris, seizing her hand.
"When I first came, I was a little afraid. You were so very nice. And then I remembered that Miss Arabella had all these nice ways, and could not bear a cloth askew, nor towels wrinkled instead of being laid straight, nor anything spilled at the table, nor an untidy room, and she was very sweet and nice. And then I tried to be as neat as I could."
"I knew you had been well brought up."
Miss Recompense was pleased always to be compared to her dear Miss Arabella. There was something grateful to her woman's heart that had long ago held a longing for a child of her own. In the ardent tone Doris always uttered this endearment.
Miss Recompense, don't you think there's something in people loving you? You want to love them in return. You want to do the things they like. And when they smile and are glad, your whole heart is light with a kind of inward sunshine. And I think if Mrs. Manning would smile on Elizabeth once in a while, and tell her what she did was nice, and that she was smart, for she is very, very smart, I know it would comfort her.
You see, people haven't thought it was best to praise children. They rarely did in my day.
But Uncle Leverett praised Warren and Betty, and always said what Aunt Elizabeth cooked and did was delightful.
Foster Leverett was one man out of 1,000. They will all miss him dreadfully.
Aunt Priscilla would have been amazed to know that Mr. Leverett had been in the estimation of Miss Recompense an ideal husband. Years ago she had compared other men with him and found them wanting. Uncle Win was much surprised to find them sitting there talking when he came home, for it was 10 o'clock. Cary returned shortly after, and the two men retired to the study. But there was a curious half-dread of some intangible influence that kept Doris awake a long while. The wind moaned outside, and now and then raised to a sombre gust, sweeping across the wide common. Oh, how lonely it must be in the old burying ground! Mr. Leverett's will had been read that evening. The business was left to Warren, as Hollis had most of his share years before. To the married daughters a small remembrance, to Betty and her mother the house in Sudbury Street, to be kept or sold as they should elect. If sold, they were to share equally. Mrs. King was very well satisfied. In the present state of affairs, Warren's part was very uncertain, and his married sisters were to be paid out of that. The building was old, and though the lot was in a good business location, the value at that time was not great.
"It seems to me the estate ought to be worth more,"
said Mrs. Manning.
"I did suppose father was quite well off, and had considerable ready money."
"So he did 2 years ago,"
answered Warren.
"but it has been spent in the effort to keep afloat. If the times should ever get better—"
"You'll pull through,"
said Hollis encouragingly. He had not suffered so much from the hard times and was prospering. The will had been remade 6 months before, after a good deal of consideration. When Mrs. King went home a few days after, she said privately to Warren,
"Do not trouble about my legacy. And if you come to hard places, I am sure Matt will help you out if he possibly can."
Warren thanked her in a broken voice. Mr. King said nearly the same thing as he grasped the young fellow's hand. They were a very lonely household. Of course Betty could not think of going away, and now that they knew what a struggle it had been for some time to keep matters going comfortably, they cast about to see what retrenchment could be made. Even if they wanted to, this would be no time to sell. The house seemed much too large for them, yet it was not planned so that any could be rented out.
"If you're set upon that,"
said Aunt Priscilla,
"I'll take the spare rooms, whether I need them or not, and we will just go on together. Strange, though, that Foster, who was so much needed, should be taken, and I, without a chick or a child, and so much older, be left behind."
There was a new trustee to be looked up for Doris. A much younger man was needed. If Cary were 5 or 6 years older, Foster Leverett's death was a great shock to Winthrop Adams. Sometimes it seemed as if a shadowy form hovered over his shoulder, warning him that middle life was passing. He had a keen disappointment, too, in his son. He had hoped to find in him an intellectual companion as the years went on, but he could plainly see that his heart was not in his profession. The young fellow's ardor had been aroused on other lines that brought him in direct opposition to the elder's views. He had gone so far as to ask his father's permission to enlist in the Navy, which had been refused, not only with prompt decision, but a feeling of amazement that a son of his should have proposed such a step. Cary had the larger love of country and the enthusiasm of youth. His father was deeply interested in the welfare and standing of the city, and he desired it to keep at the head. He had hoped to see his son one of the rising men of the coming generation. War horrified him. It called forth the cruel and brutal side of most men. It was to be undertaken only for extremely urgent reasons, as the last hope and salvation of one's country. We had gained a right to stand among the nations of the world. It was time now that we should take upon ourselves something higher, the cultivation of literature and the fine arts. To plunge the country into war again would be setting it back decades. He had taken a great deal of pleasure in the meetings of the Anthology Club and the effort they had made to keep afloat a magazine of polite literature. The little supper, which was very plain, the literary chat, the discussions of English poets and essayists, several of which were reprinted at this era, and the encouragement of native writers, of whom there were but few except in the line of sermons and orations. By 1793 there had been 2 American novels published, and though we should smile over them now, we can find their compeers in several of the old English novels that crop out now and then, exhumed from what was meant to be a kindly oblivion. The magazine had been given up, and the life somehow had gone out of the club. There was a plan to form a reading room and library to take its place. Men like Mr. Adams were anxious to advance the intellectual reputation of the town, though few people found sufficient leisure to devote to the idea of a national literature. Others said, what need when we have the world of brilliant English thinkers that we can never excel, the poets and novelists? Let us study those and be content. The incidents of the winter had been quite depressing to Mr. Adams. Cary was around to the Royalls nearly every evening, sometimes to other places, and at discussions that would have alarmed his father still more if he had known it. The young fellow's conscience gave him many twinges. Children, obey your parents had been instilled into every generation, and until a boy was of age he had no lawful right to think for himself. So it happened that Doris became more of a companion to Uncle Win. They rambled about as the spring opened and noted the improvements. Old Frog Lane was being changed into Boylston Street. Every year the historic common took on some new charm. There was the old elm that dated back to tradition, for no one could remember its youth. She was interested in the conflicts that had ushered in the freedom of the American colonies. Here the British waited behind their earthworks for Washington to attack them, just as every winter boys congregated behind their snowy walls and fought mimic battles. Indeed, during General Gage's administration, the soldiers had driven the boys off their coasting place on the common, and in a body they had gone to the governor and demanded their rights, which were restored to them. Many a famous celebration had occurred here, and here the militia met on training days and had their banquets in tents. At the first training, all the colored population was allowed to throng the common, but at the second, when the ancient and honorable artillery chose its new officers, they were strictly prohibited. Many of the rope walks up at the northern end were silent now. Indeed, everybody seemed waiting with bated breath for something to happen, but all nature went on its usual way, and made the town a little world of beauty with wild flowers and shrubs, and the gardens coming into bloom, and the myriads of fruit trees with their crowns of snowy white and pink in all gradations.
I think the world never was so beautiful,
said Doris to Uncle Winthrop. It was so delightful to have such an appreciative companion, even if she was only a little girl. Cary's birthday was the last of May, and it was decided to have the family party at the same time. Cary's young friends would be invited in the evening, but for the elders there would be the regular supper.
You will have your freedom suit, and afterward you can do just as you like,
said Doris laughingly. She and Cary had been quite friendly of late, young mannish reserve having given place to a brotherly regard.
Do you suppose I can do just as I like?
He studied the eager face.
Of course you wouldn't want to do anything Uncle Win would not like.
Cary flushed.
I wonder if fathers always know what is best. And when you are a man,
he began.
Don't you want to study law?
Under some circumstances, I should like it.
Would you like keeping a store, or having a factory, or building beautiful houses? Architecture, I believe the fine part is called. Or painting portraits like Copley and Stewart and the young Mr. Alston up in Court Street?
No, I can't aspire to that kind of genius, and I am sure I shouldn't like shopkeeping. I am just an ordinary young fellow, and I am afraid I shall always be a disappointment to the kindest of fathers. I wish there were 3 or 4 other children.
How strange it would seem,
returned Doris musingly.
I am glad he has you, little Doris.
Are you really glad?
Her face was alight with joy.
Sometimes I have almost wondered.
Don't wonder any more. You are like a dear little sister. During the last 6 months, it has been a great pleasure to me to see Father so fond of you. I hope you will never go away.
I don't mean to. I love Uncle Win dearly. It used to trouble me sometimes when Uncle Leverett was alive, lest I couldn't love quite even, you know.
And a tiny line came in her smooth brow.
What an idea!
With a soft smile that suggested his father.
It's curious how you can love so many people,
she said reflectively. At first the Leveretts thought they could not come to the party, but Uncle Winthrop insisted strongly. Some of the other relatives had lost members from their households. All the gaiety would be reserved for the evening, but Cary said they would miss Betty very much. They had a pleasant afternoon, and Betty was finally prevailed upon to stay a little while in the evening. Cary was congratulated by the elder relatives, who said many pleasant things and gave him good wishes as to his future success. One of the cousins proposed his health, and Cary replied in a very entertaining manner. There was a birthday cake that he had to cut and pass around.
I think Cary has been real delightful,
said Betty.
I've never felt intimately acquainted with him, because he has always seemed rather distant, and went with the quality and all that, and we are rather plain people. Oh, how proud of him Uncle Win must be!
He certainly was proud of his gracious attentions to the elders, and his pleasant way of taking the rather tiresome compliments of a few of the old ladies who had known his grandfather Cary as well as his grandfather Adams. Aunt Elizabeth and Aunt Priscilla sat up in the room of Miss Recompense with a few of the guests who wanted to see the young people gather. There were 4 colored musicians, and they began to tune their instruments out on the rustic settee at the side of the front garden, where the beautiful drooping honey locusts hid them from sight, and made even the tuning seem enchanting. Girls in white gowns trooped up the path. Young men in the height of fashion carried fans and nosegays for them. There was laughing and chattering and floating back and forth to the dressing rooms. Madame Royall came with Miss Alice and Helen, who was allowed to go occasionally under her wing. Eudora had been permitted just to look on a while and to return with grandmamma. The large parlor was cleared of the small and dainty tables and articles likely to be in the way of the dancers. The first was to be a new march to a patriotic air, and the guests stood on the stairs to watch them come out of the lower door of the long room, march through the hall, and enter the parlor at the other door. Oh, what a pretty crowd they were! The old continental styles had not all gone out, but were toned down a little. There were very pretty embroidered satin petticoats and sheer gowns falling away at the sides, with a train one had to tuck up under the belt when one really danced. Hair of all shades done high on the head with a comb of silver of brilliance or tortoiseshell, so clear that you could see the limpid variations. Pompadour rolls, short curls, dainty puffs, many of the dark heads powdered, laces and frills and ribbons, and dainty feet in satin slippers and silken hose. After that they formed quadrilles in the parlor. There was space for 3 and 1 in the hall. Eudora and Doris patted their feet on the stairs in unison, and clasping each other's hands smiled and moved their heads in perfect time. Aunt Priscilla admitted that it was a beautiful sight, but she had her doubts about it. Betty was sorry there was such a sad cause for her not being among them. Even Cary had expressed regrets about it. Then the Leveretts and Madame Royall went home. A few of the elders had a game of loo, and Mr. Adams played chess with Morris Winslow, whose pretty wife still enjoyed dancing, though he was growing stout, and begged to be excused on a warm night. They played forfeits afterward, and had a merry time. Then there was supper, and they drank toasts and made bright speeches, and there was a great deal of jesting and gay laughter, and much wishing of success, a judgeship in the future, a mission abroad perhaps, a pretty and loving wife, a happy and honorable old age. They drank the health of Mr. Winthrop as well, and congratulated him on his promising son. He was very proud and happy that night, and planned within his heart what he would do for his boy. Doris kept begging to stay up a little longer. The music was so fascinating, for the band was playing soft strains out on the front porch while the guests were at supper. She sat on the stairs quite enchanted with the gay scene. The guests wandered about the hall and parlour and chatted joyously. Then there was a movement toward breaking up. Miss Alice espied her.
"Oh, you midget! Are you up here at midnight?"
She cried.
"Have we done Cary ample honor on his arrival at man's estate?"
You are all so beautiful,
said Doris breathlessly.
And the dancing and the music, it was splendid.
Helen kissed her good night with girlish effusion. Some of the other ladies spoke to her, and Mrs. Winslow said,
"No doubt you will have a party in this old house, but you will have a girl's advantage. You need not wait until you're 21.
When the last good nights were said and the lights put out, Cary Adams wondered whether he would have the determination to avow his plans. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The High Resolve of Youth. War was declared. The President, James Madison, proclaimed it June 18, 1812. Hostilities opened promptly. True, England's navy was largely engaged with France in the tremendous effort to keep Napoleon confined within the boundaries that he had at one time assented to by treaty, but at that period she had over 1,000 vessels afloat, while America had only 17 warships in her navy to brave them. There was a call for men and money. The Indian troubles had been fomented largely by England. They had been fighting on the borders, but the Battle of Tippecanoe had broken the power of Tecumseh, for the time at least. But now the hopes of the Indian chieftain revived, and the country was beset by both land and naval warfare. The town had been all along opposed to war. It had been said of Boston a few years before that she was like Tyre of old, and that her ships whitened every sea. Still, now that the fiat had gone forth, the latent enthusiasm came to the surface, and men were eager to enlist. A company had been studying naval tactics at Charleston, and most of them offered their services, filled with the enthusiasm of youth and brimming with indignation at the treatment our sailors were continually receiving. Still, the little navy had proudly distinguished itself in the Mediterranean, and the Constitution had gained for herself the sobriquet of Old Ironsides, a Boston-built vessel, though the live oak, the red cedar, and the pitch pine had come from South Carolina. But Paul Revere had furnished the copper bolts and spikes, and when the ship was recoppered later on, they came from the same place. Ephraim Thayer at the south end had made her gun carriages, and her sails were manufactured in the old granary building. A bunch of pine boards with a bit of striped bunting had been the enemy's disdainful description of our youthful navy, and now they were to try their prowess with the mistress of the seas, who had defeated the combined navies of Europe. No wonder the country stood astounded over its own daring. Everything afloat was hurriedly equipped as a war vessel. The solid, far-sighted men of New York and New England shook their heads over the great mistake Congress and the President had made. Warren Leverett began to talk about enlisting. Business had been running behind. True, he could appeal to his brother-in-law, King. He had sounded Hollis, who declared he had all he could to do to keep afloat himself. Mrs. Leverett besought him to take no hasty step. What could they do without him? They might break up the home. Electa would be glad to have Betty. There was something she could do, but Aunt Priscilla, whose health was really poor. Aunt Priscilla understood the drift presently and the perplexity. Warren admitted that if he had some money to tide him over, he would fight through. The war couldn't last forever.
"And you never thought of me,"
declared Aunt Priscilla, pretending to be quite indignant.
"See here, Warren Leverett. When I made my will, I looked out for you and Betty. Mary Manning shan't hoard up any of my money, and Lecty King, well, thank the Lord, doesn't want it. So, if you're to have it in the end, you may as well take some of it now, for as I see. I shall have enough to last my time out, and I'm settled and comfortable here, and don't want to be routed out and set down elsewhere."
Warren and his mother were surprised and overcome by the offer. He would take it only on condition that he should pay Aunt Priscilla the interest. But his business stirred up wonderfully. Still, they all felt it was very generous in Aunt Priscilla, whose money had really been her idol. Doris had gone over from her music lessons one afternoon. They were always so glad to see her. Aunt Priscilla thought a piano in such times as these was almost defying Providence, but even the promise of that did not spoil Doris, and they were always glad to see her drop in and hear her dainty bit of news. They wanted very much to keep her to supper.
Why, they...
Which meant the family at home.
Will be sure you have stayed here or at the Royals. Mr. Winslow has given ever so much money toward the fitting out of a vessel. They are all very patriotic, and Cary's uncle, Mr. March, has gone in heart and hand. I don't know which is right,
said Betty with a sigh.
But now that we are in it, I hope we will win.
But Doris was afraid Miss Recompense would feel anxious, and she promised to come in a few days and stay to supper. It was very odd that just as she reached the corner, Cousin Cary should cross the street and join her.
I have been down having a talk with Warren,
he said as if in explanation.
I wish I had a good, plodding business head like that, and Warren isn't lacking in the higher qualities either. If there was money enough to keep the house going, he would enlist. He had almost resolved to when this stir in business came.
Oh, I don't know what his mother would have done. If Uncle Leverett was alive,
he would have consented in a minute. Someone's sons must go,
Cary said decisively.
No, don't go straight home. Come over to the common. Doris, you are only a little girl, but I want to talk to you. There is no one else.
Doris glanced at him in amazement. He was quite generally grave, though he sometimes teased her and occasionally read with her and explained any difficult point, but she always felt so like a very little girl with him. They went on in silence, however, until they crossed Common Street and passed on under the magnificent elms. Clumps of shrubbery were blooming. Vines ran riotously over supports, and roses and honeysuckle made the air sweet.
Doris,
his voice had a little huskiness in it.
You are very fond of Father, and he loves you quite as if you were his own child. Oh, I wish you were. I wish he had 6 sons and daughters. If Mother had lived.
Yes,
Doris said at length, in the long silence broken only by the song and whistle of myriad birds.
I don't know how to tell you. I can't soften things, incidents, or explanations. I am so apt to go straight to the point, and though it may be honorable, it is not always wisest or best. But I can't help it now. I have enlisted in the Navy. We start for Annapolis this evening.
Oh, Cary, and Uncle Win.
That is it. That gives me a heartache, I must confess. For, you see, I can't go and tell him in a manly way, as I would like. We have had some talks over it. I asked him before I was of age, and he refused, in the most decisive manner, to consider it. He said if I went, I would have to choose between the country and him, which meant a separation for years, maybe. It is strange, too, for he is noble and just and patriotic on certain lines. I do think he would spend any money on me, give me everything I could possibly want, but he feels in some way that I am his, and it is my duty to do with my life what he desires, not what I like. I am talking over your head. You are such a little girl, and so simple-hearted, and I have really come to love you a great deal, Doris.
She looked up with a soft smile, but there were tears in her eyes.
You see, a big boy who has no sisters doesn't get used to little girls, and when he really begins to admire them, they are generally older. Then, I have always been with boys and young men. I was glad when you came, because Father was so interested in you, and I thought he had begun to love you so much that he wouldn't really mind if I went away. But, you see, his heart would be big enough for a house full of children.
Oh, why do you go? He will be broken-hearted.
Little Doris, I shall be broken-hearted if I stay. I shall begin to hate law. Maybe I shall take to drink. Young fellows do at times. I know I shall be just good for nothing. I should like best to talk it over dispassionately with him, but that can't be done. We should both say things that would hurt each other, and that we should regret all our lives. I've written him a long letter, but I wanted to tell someone. I thought of Betty first, and Madame Royall, but no one can comfort him like you. Then I wanted you to feel, Doris, that I was not an ungrateful, disobedient son. I wish we could think alike about the war, but it seems that we cannot. And because you are here, and Doris, you are a very sweet little girl, and you will love him always. I know. I give him in your charge. I hope to come back, but the chances of war are a fearful sort, and if I should not, will you keep him always, Doris? Will you be son and daughter to him as you grow up? Oh, Doris, don't cry. People die every day, you know, staying at home. I have often thought how sad it was that my mother and both your parents should die so young.
His voice broke then. They came to a rustic seat and sat down. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips.
If I shouldn't ever come back,
tremulously,
I should like to feel at the last moment there was someone who would tell him that my very latest thought was of him and his tender love all my 21 years. I want you to make him feel that it was no disrespect to him, but love for my country that impelled me to the step. You will understand it better when you grow older, and I can trust you to do me full justice and to be tender to him. And at first, Doris, when I can, I shall write to you. If he doesn't forbid you, I want you to answer if I can get letters. This is a sad, sad talk for a little girl.
Doris tried very hard not to sob. She seemed to understand intuitively how it was, and that to make any appeal could only pain him without persuading. If she were as wise and bright as Betty.
That is all. Or if I said any more, it would be a repetition, and it is awfully hard on you. But you will love him and comfort him.
I shall love him and stay with them all my life,
said Doris with tender solemnity. They were both too young to understand all that such a promise implied.
My dear little sister.
He rose and, stooping over, kissed her on the fair forehead.
I will walk back to the house with you,
he added as she rose. Neither of them said a word until they reached the corner. Then he took both hands, and kissing her again, turned away, feeling that he could not even utter a good-bye. Doris stood quite still, as if she was stunned. She was not crying in any positive fashion, but the tears dropped silently. She could not go indoors, so she went down to the big apple tree that had a seat all around the trunk. Was Uncle Win at home? Then she heard voices. Miss Recompense had a visitor, and she was very glad. The lady, an old friend, stayed to supper. Uncle Win did not make his appearance. Doris took a book afterward and sat out on the stoop, but reading was only a pretense. She was frightened now at having a secret, and it seemed such a solemn thing as she recalled what she had promised. She would like to spend all her life with Uncle Win, but could she care for him and make him happy when the one great love of his life was gone? Miss Recompense walked out to the gate with her visitor, and they had a great many last bits to say, and then she watched her going down the street.
Child, you can't see to read,
she said to Doris.
I think it is damp. You had better come in. Mr. Adams will not be home before 10.
Doris entered the lighted hall and stood a moment uncertain.
How pale and heavy-eyed you look,
exclaimed Miss Recompense.
Does your head ache? Have they some new trouble in Sudbury Street?
Oh, no, but I am tired. I think I will go to bed. Good night, dear Miss Recompense.
And she gave her a gentle hug. She cried a little softly to her pillow. Had Cary gone? When Uncle Win came home, he would find the letter. She dreaded tomorrow. Cary had one more errand before he started. He had said good-bye to them at Madame Royall's and announced his enlistment, but he had asked Alice to meet him at the foot of the garden. They were not lovers, though he was perhaps quite in love, and he knew that he had only to speak to gain his father's consent and have his way to matrimony made easy, since it was Alice Royall. But he had never been quite sure that she cared for him with her whole soul, as Isabel had cared for Morris Winslow, and if he won her, would he, could he go away? He used to wonder later on how much was pure patriotism and how much a desire to stand well with Alice Royall. She was proudly patriotic and had stirred his blood many a time with her wishes and desires for the country. Grandmamma Royall had laughed a little at her vehemence and said it was fortunate she was not a boy. I should enlist at once, or what would be better yet, I would beg Brother Morris to fit out a warship, and look up the men to command it, and go in any capacity. I should not wait for a higher-up appointment. When Cary confessed his step first to her, she caught his hands in hers so soft and delicate.
I knew you were the stuff of which heroes were made,
she cried exultantly.
Oh, Cary, I shall pray for you day and night, and you will come back crowned with honors.
If I come back,
You will. Take my word for your guerdon. I can't tell you how I know, but I am sure you will. I can see you in the future.
She paused, flushed with excitement, her eyes intense, her rosy lips tremulous, and looked indeed as if she might be inspired. So she met him again at the garden gate for a last good-bye. Young people who had been well brought up did not play at love-making in those days, though they might be warm friends. A girl seldom gave or received caresses until the elders had signified assent. An engagement was quite a solemn thing, not lightly to be entered into, and even to himself Cary seemed very young. All his instincts were those of a gentleman, and in his father he had had an example of the most punctilious honour. They walked up and down a few moments. He pressed tender kisses on her fair hand, about which there always seemed to cling the odour of roses, and then he tore himself away with a passionate sorrow that his father, the nearest in human ties of love, could not bid him Godspeed. The next morning Doris wondered what had happened. There was a loneliness in the very air, as there had been when Uncle Leverett died. The sky was overcast, not exactly promising a storm, but soft and penetrative, as if presaging sorrow. Oh, yes, she remembered now. She dressed herself and went quietly downstairs.
You may as well come and have your breakfast,
exclaimed Miss Recompense.
Your uncle sent down word that he had a headache and begged not to be disturbed. He was up a long while after he came home last night. It must have been past midnight when he went to bed. I wish he did not get so deeply interested in improvements and everything. And if we are to be bombarded and destroyed, I don't see any sense in laying out new streets and filling up ponds and wasting the money of the town.
It seemed to Doris as if she could not swallow a mouthful. She tried heroically. Then she went out and gathered a bunch of roses for Uncle Win's study. She generally read French and Latin a while with him in the morning. Then she made her bed, dusted her room, put her books in her satchel, and went to school in an unwilling sort of fashion. How long the morning seemed! Then there was a half-hour in deportment. We should call it physical culture at present. All the girls were gay and chatty. Eudora told her about a new lace stitch. Grandmamma had been out yesterday, where there was such an elegant Spanish woman with coal-black eyes and hair. Her family had fled to this country to escape the horrors of war. They had been rich, but were now quite poor, and she was thinking of having a needlework class. Did Eudora know Cary had gone away? Uncle Win came out to dinner. She was a little late. He glanced up and gave a faint half-smile, but oh, how deadly pale he was.
Dear Uncle Winthrop, is your headache better?
She asked with gentle solicitude.
A little,
he said gravely. It was a very quiet meal. Although Mr. Winthrop Adams had a delicate appearance, he was rarely ill. Now there were deep rings under his eyes, and the utter depression was sad indeed to behold. Doris nearly always ran in the study and gossiped girlishly about the morning's employments. Now she sauntered out on the porch. There was neither music nor writing class. She wondered if she had better sew. She was learning to do that quite nicely, but the stocking still remained a puzzle.
Doris,
said a gentle voice through the open window, and the sadness pierced her heart. She rose and went in. Solomon lay on his cushion in the corner, and even he, she thought, had a troubled look in his eyes. Uncle Win sat by the table, and there lay Cary's letter. She put her arms about his neck and pressed her soft warm cheek against his, so cool that it startled her.
My dear little Doris,
he began,
I am childless. I have no son. Cary has gone away, against my wishes, in the face of my prohibition. I do not suppose he will ever return alive. And so I have given him up, Doris.
His voice failed him. He had meant to say,
You are all I have.
Uncle Win, may I tell you, I saw him yesterday in the afternoon, and he told me he had enlisted.
Oh, then you know.
The tone somehow grew harder.
Dear Uncle Win, I think he could not help going. He was very brave, and he was sorry too. His eyes were full of tears while he was talking, and he asked me,
To intercede for him?
No, to stay here with you always. He said I was like a little sister, and I promised. Uncle Win, if you will keep me, I will be your little girl all my life long. I will never leave you. I love you very dearly, for since Uncle Leverett went away, I have given you both loves.
She stood there in silence many minutes. Oh, how comforting was the clasp of the soft arms about his neck! How consoling the dear, assuring voice!
"Will you tell me about it?"
he said at length. She was a wise little thing, though I think her chief wisdom lay in her desire not to give anyone pain. Some few sentences she left out, others she softened.
"Oh,"
she said beseechingly,
"you will not be angry with him, Uncle Winthrop? I think it is very brave and heroic in him. It is like some of the old soldiers in the Latin stories. I shall study hard now, so I can read about them all, and I shall pray all the time that the war will come to an end. We shall be so proud and glad when he returns, and then you will have 2 children again."
"Yes, we hope for the war to end speedily. It ought never to have begun. What can we do against an enemy that has 100 arms ready to destroy us? Little Doris, I am glad to have you."
Winthrop Adams was not a man to talk over his sorrows. He had been wounded to the quick. He had not dreamed that his son would disregard his wishes. His fatherly pride was up in arms, but he did not turn his wounded side to the world. He quietly admitted that his son had gone to Annapolis, and received the congratulations of friends who sincerely believed it was time to strike. Salem was busy at her wharves, where peaceable merchantmen were being transformed into war vessels. Charleston was all astir, and sailors donned the uniform proudly. New York and Baltimore joined in the general activity. The Constellation was fitting out at Norfolk. The Chesapeake, the United States, and the President were to be made famous on history's page. Privateers without number were hurried to the fore. The Constitution had quite a reception in New York, and she started out with high endeavors. She had not gone far, however, before she found herself followed by 3 British frigates, and among them the Guerrière, whose Captain Commodore Hull had met in New York. To be captured in this manner, for fighting against such odds would be of no avail, was not to be thought of, so there was nothing but a race before him. If he could reach Boston he would save his ship and his men, and somewhere perhaps gain a victory. Ah, what a race it was! The men put forth all their strength, all their ingenuity. At times it seemed as if capture was imminent. By night and by day, trying every experiment, working until they dropped from sheer fatigue, and after an hour or 2 of rest going at it again, Captain Hull kept her well to the windward, and with various manoeuvrings puzzled the pursuers. Then Providence favored them with a fine driving rain, and she flew along in the darkness of the night, hardly daring to hope. But at dawn, after a 3 days' race, Boston was in sight, and her enemies were left behind. But that was not in any sense a complete victory, and she started out again to face her enemy, and conquer if she could, for her captain knew the British ship Guerrière was lying somewhere in wait for her. Everybody prayed and hoped. Firing was heard, but at such a distance from the harbor nothing could be decided. The frontier losses had been depressing in the extreme. Boston had hung her flags at half-mast for the brave dead. But suddenly a report came that the Constitution had been victorious, and that the Guerrière, after having been disabled beyond any power of restoration, had been sent to a watery grave. In a moment it seemed as if the whole town was in a transport of joy. Flags were waving everywhere, and a gaily decorated flotilla went out in the harbor to greet the brave, battle-scarred veteran. And when the tale of the great victory ran from lip to lip, the rejoicing was unbounded. A national salute was fired, which was returned from the ship. The streets were in festive array and crowded with people who could not restrain their wild rejoicing. The Guerrière, which was to drive the insolent striped bunting from the face of the seas, had been swept away in a brief hour and a half, and the bunting waved above her grave. That night the story was told over in many a home. The loss of the Constitution had been very small compared to that of the Guerrière, which had 23 dead and 56 wounded, and Captain Dacres headed the list of prisoners. There was a grand banquet at the Exchange Coffee House. The freedom of the city was presented to Captain Hull, and New York sent him a handsome sword. Congress voted him a gold medal, and Philadelphia a service of plate. At one blow the prestige of invincibility claimed for the British Navy was shattered, and now the Constitution's earlier escape from the hot chase of the 3 British frigates was understood to be a great race for the nation's honor and welfare, as well as for their own lives, and at last the baffled pursuers, outsailed, outmaneuvered, dropped behind with no story of success to tell, and were to gnaw their hearts in bitterness when they heard of this glorious achievement. Uncle Winthrop took Doris and Betty out in the carriage, that they might see the great rejoicing from all points. Everywhere one heard bits of the splendid action and the intrepidity of Captain Hull and his men.
"I only wish Cary had been in it,"
said Betty with sparkling eyes. Warren told them that when Lieutenant Reed came on deck with Captain Hull's compliments and wished to know if they had struck their flag, Captain Dockray's replied,
"Well, I don't know. Our mizzenmast is gone, our mainmast is gone, and I think you may say, on the whole, that we have struck our flag."
One of the points that pleased Mr. Adams very much was the official report of Captain Dockray's, who wished to acknowledge, as a matter of courtesy, that the conduct of Captain Hull and his officers to our men had been that of a brave enemy, the greatest care being taken to prevent our losing the smallest trifle, and the kindest attention being paid to the wounded. More than one officer was to admit the same fact before the war ended, even if we did not receive the like consideration from our enemies.
"I only wish Cary had been on the Constitution,"
said Betty eagerly.
"I should be proud of the fact to my dying day, and tell it over to my grandchildren."
A tint of color wavered over Uncle Winthrop's pale face. No one mentioned Cary, out of a sincere regard for his father, except people outside who did not know the truth of his sudden departure, though many of his young personal friends were aware of his interest in his study on the subject. Old Boston had a gala time, surely. The flags floated for days, and everyone wore a kind of triumphant aspect. That her own ship, built with so much native work and equipments, should be the first to which a British frigate should strike her colors was indeed a triumph, though there were not wanting voices across the sea to say the Guerrière should have gone down with flying colors, but even that would have been impossible. Miss Recompense and Uncle Winthrop began to discuss Revolutionary times, and Doris listened with a great deal of interest. She delighted to identify herself strongly with her adopted country, and in her secret heart she was proud of Cary, though she could not be quite sure he was right in the step he had taken. They missed him so much. She tried in many ways to make up the loss, and her devotion went to her uncle's heart. If they could only hear! Not to know where he was seemed so hard to bear. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 20. A Visitor for Doris. Doris was in the little still room, as it was called, a large sort of pantry shelved on one side, with numerous drawers, and a kind of dresser with glass doors on another. By the window there were a table and the dainty little still where Miss Recompense made perfumes and extracts. There were boxes of sweet herbs, useful ones, bottles of medicinal cordials and salves. Miss Recompense was a master hand at such things, and the neighbors around thought her as good as a doctor. It was so fragrant in this little room that Doris always had a vague impression of a beautiful country. She had a kind of poetical temperament. She hoped some day to be able to write verses. Helen Chapman had written a pretty song for a friend's birthday and had it set to music. The quartet sang it so well that the leading paper had praised it. There was no one she could confess her secret ambition to, but if she ever did achieve anything, she would confide in Uncle Winthrop. So she sat here with all manner of vague, delightful ideas floating through her brain, steeped with the fragrance of balms and odors.
"Please 'em."
And Dinah stood in the door in all the glory of her gay afternoon turban, which seemed to make her face more black and shining.
"Please 'em. There's a young sodger man just come. He got a bundle, and he say he got strict directions to give it to Missy. And here's the ticket."
"Oh, for me?"
Doris took it eagerly and read aloud.
"Lieutenant E.D. Hawthorne. Oh, Miss Recompense, it's from Cary, I know."
And for a moment she looked undecided. Miss Recompense had on her morning gown, rather faded, though she had changed it for dinner. Her sleeves were pushed above the elbow. Her hands were a little stained, and just now she could not leave her concoction without great injury to it, though it was evidently improper for a child like Doris, or indeed a young lady, to see a strange gentleman alone, and Mr. Adams was out. Doris cut the Gordian knot by flashing through the kitchen and entering the lower end of the hall. The young man stood viewing the destruction of the Spanish Armada. But he turned at the sort of bird-like flutter and glanced at the vision that all his life long he thought the prettiest sight he had ever beheld. She had on a simple white frock, though it was one of her best, with a narrow embroidered ruffle around the bottom that Madame Royall had given her. When it was a little crumpled, she put it on for afternoon wear. The neck was cut a small square with a bit of edging around it, gathered with a pink ribbon tied in a bow in front. She still wore her hair in ringlets. It did not seem to grow very fast, but she had been promoted to a pompadour, the front hair being brushed up over a cushion. That left innumerable short ends to curl in tiny tendrils about her forehead. Oddly enough, too, she had on a pink apron Betty had made out of the best breadth of pink India lawn frock she had worn out. It had pretty pockets with a bow of the same.
"Miss Doris Adams!"
exclaimed the young lieutenant.
"I should have known you in a minute, although you are—"
He paused and flushed, for Cary had said,
"She isn't exactly handsome, but very sweet-looking, with pretty, eager eyes and fair hair."
He checked himself suddenly, understanding the impropriety of paying her the compliment at the end of his tongue, but he thought her an enchanting picture.
"You are larger than I supposed. Adams always said my little cousin."
I was little when I first came, and I have grown ever so much this summer, since Cary went away. Oh, have you seen him? How is he? Where is he?"
Doris had a soft and curiously musical voice, the sound that lingered with a sort of cadence. Her eyes shone in eager expectation. Her curved red lips were dewy sweet.
"He's well. He sailed on the United States as a midshipman. I saw him at Annapolis. Indeed, we came quite near to being on the same vessel. He is a fine young fellow, but he doesn't look a day over 18, and there is a family resemblance."
But he thought Doris would make a much handsomer young woman than Cary would a young man.
"And I have a small packet for you that I was to deliver to no one else."
He held it out to her with a smile. It was sealed, and was also secured with a bit of cord, which, of course, should have been a thread of silk, but we saved our refinements of chivalry for other purposes.
"He's going to make a fine, earnest, patriotic sailor. You will never hear anything about him that you need to be ashamed of. He told me his father wasn't quite reconciled to the step, but after this splendid victory in Boston Harbor, just straying a little point,"
laughingly,
"the town may be well proud of the courageous navy, and I hope you will hear good news of him. One thing you may be sure of, he will never show the white feather."
Oh, how her eyes glistened! There were tears in them as well.
He described the house to me, and the town. I've never been in Boston before, and have come from Washington on important business. I return this evening. I don't know when I shall see him again, and letters to vessels are so uncertain. That seems the hardest part of all. But he may happen in this very port before a great while. One never knows. Believe that I am very glad to have the opportunity of coming myself, and if in the future I should run across him on the high seas or the shore even,
smiling again,
I shall feel better acquainted and more than ever interested in him. There is one great favor I should like to ask. Could you show me the study? Adams talked so much about that and his father."
"It is here."
Doris made a pretty gesture with her hand, and he walked to the door, glancing around. There was a high-backed chair by the table, with its covering of Cordovan leather, and he could imagine the father sitting there.
"One would want a year to journey around these four walls,"
he said with a soft sigh.
"A library like this is an uncommon sight. And you study here? Adams said you had been such a comfort and pleasure to his father. Oh, what a magnificent cat!"
"Kitty is mine,"
said Doris. She crossed over to the window, and Solomon rose to his fullest extent, gave a comfortable stretch, and rubbed the cheek of his young mistress, then arched his back, studied the visitor out of sleepy green eyes, and began to turn round him 3 times in cat fashion. They both laughed at that. Did Doris know what a pretty picture she made of herself in her girlish grace?
Thank you. What a splendid old hall. I should like to spend a day looking around. But I had only the briefest while, and I was afraid I should not get here. So I must be satisfied with my glimpse. I shall hope that fate will send me this way again when I have more leisure. May I pay a visit here?
Oh, yes,
returned Doris impulsively,
and I can never tell you how glad I am for this.
touching the little packet caressingly to her cheek.
There isn't any word with enough thanks and gratitude in it.
I'm glad to have earned your gratitude. And now I must say farewell, for I know you are impatient to read your letter.
He stepped out on the porch and bowed with a kind of courtly grace. Doris realized then that he was a very handsome young man.
Miss Doris?
He paused halfway down the steps.
I wonder if I might be so bold as to ask for yonder rose, the last on its parent stem.
Thomas More had not yet immortalized the last rose of summer and given it such pathetic possibilities.
Oh, yes,
she said.
That is a late-blooming rose. Indeed, it blooms twice in the season.
Only this morning she had gathered a bowl of rose leaves for Miss Recompense, and this one had opened since. She broke the stem and handed it to him.
It is a very little gift for all you have brought me,
she added in a soft, heartfelt tone.
Thank you. I shall cherish it sacredly.
Miss Recompense had hurried and donned a gingham gown and a fresh cap. She had come just in time to see the gift, and the manner in which the young man received it alarmed her, and when he had walked down to the street he turned and bowed and made a farewell gesture with his hand. Doris had nothing to cut the cord around the packet, so she bit it with her pretty teeth and tore off the wrapper, coming up the steps. Then raising her eyes she sprang forward.
Oh, dear Miss Recompense, letters, see! A letter from Cary all to myself, and one for Uncle Win. I will just put that on his table to be a joyful surprise. And may I come and read mine to you? He was in such a hurry, though really I did not ask him to stay. Was that impolite?
No, under the circumstances.
She cleared her throat a little, but the lecture on propriety would not materialize.
Dear little Doris, think of that. Wouldn't Cary be surprised to see how much I have grown? May I sit here?
Miss Recompense was about to decant some of her preparations. Doris took the high stool and read eagerly, though now and then a little break came in her voice. The journey to Annapolis with half a dozen college chums bent on the same errand, the being mustered into the country service and assigned to positions, meeting famous people and hearing some thrilling news, and at last the order for sailing were vivid as a picture. She was to let Madame Royall and the household read all this, and he sent respectful regard to all of them, and real love to all the Leveretts. There had been moments when he was wild to see them again, but after all he was prouder than ever to be of service to his country, who needed her bravest sons as much now as in her 7-year struggle. There was a loose page beginning, "For your eyes alone, Doris," and she laid it by, for she felt even now that she wanted to cry over her brave cousin. Then he spoke of Lieutenant Hawthorne, who had been instrumental in getting him his appointment, and who had undertaken to see this would reach her safely, and so many farewells, as if he could hardly say the very last one. Miss Recompense wiped her eyes and stepped about softly, as if her whole body was pervaded with a new tenderness. She made little comments to restore the equilibrium, so that neither would give way to undue emotion.
Miss Recompense, do you think I might run up to Aunt Elizabeth's with my letter? They will all want to hear.
Why, I see no objections, child. And then if you wanted to go to Madame Royall's, but I think they will keep you to tea at Sudbury Street. Let Betty or Warren walk home with you. Take off your apron.
Doris read a half-dozen lines of her own personal letter and laid it in the bottom of her work-box that had come from India and had a subtle fragrance. She did not want to cry in real earnest, as she felt she should, with all these references to Uncle Win. She tied on her hat and said good afternoon, and really did run part of the way. They were just overflowing with joy to hear, only Betty said,
"What a shame Cary had to go before the glorious news of the Constitution. There was a chance of 2 days after he had written his letter, so he might have heard."
Postage was high at that time and mails uncertain, so letters in important matters were often trusted to private hands. Then Lieutenant Hawthorne had not gone to Boston as soon as he expected. Betty had some news, too. Mr. and Mrs. King were going to Washington, perhaps for the greater part of the winter. As they walked home, Betty rehearsed her perplexities to Doris. It was odd how many matters were confided to this girl of 13, but she seemed so wise and sensible and sympathetic.
If it wasn't quite such hard times, and if Warren could marry and bring Mercy home, she's an excellent housekeeper, just the wife for a struggling young man, Mother admits. But whether she would like it, and whether Aunt Priscilla would feel comfortable, are great questions. She's been so good to Warren. Mary badgered him dreadfully about her part. If Mary was a little more like Electa...
Warren had been keeping company with Mercy Gilman for the last year. She was a bright, cheerful, industrious girl, well brought up, and the engagement was acceptable to both families. Young people paid more deference to their elders then. Warren felt that he could not go away from home, and surely there was room enough if they could all agree.
It's odd how many splendid things come to Electa, though it may be because she is always willing to take advantage of them. They have rented their house in New York, and are to take some rooms in Washington. Bessie and Leverett are to be put in school, and she takes the 2 little ones. Their meals are to be sent in from a cook shop. Of course she can't be very gay, being in mourning. Everybody says Mrs. Madison is so charming.
Oh, I wish you could go,
sighed Doris.
And Mary is always wondering why I do not come and stay with her, and sew and help along. Oh, Doris, what if I should be the old maid aunt and go visiting round? For there hasn't been a soul asked me to keep company yet.
And Betty laughed, but she was not very anxious on the subject. They reached the corner and kissed each other good night. Miss Recompense sat on the stoop with a little shawl around her shoulders. She drew Doris down beside her and inquired about her visit. While there was much that was stern and hard and reticent in the Puritan character, there was also an innate delicacy concerning the inward life. They made few appeals to each other's sympathies. Perhaps this very reserve gave them strength to endure trials heroically and not burden others. Miss Recompense had judged wisely that Mr. Adams would prefer to receive his missive alone. His first remark had been the usual question.
Where is Doris?
Oh, we have had quite an adventure. A call from a young naval officer. Here is his card. He brought letters to you and Doris, and she was eager to take hers over to Betty. She will stay to supper.
He scrutinized the card while his breath came in strangling gasps, but he preserved his composure outwardly.
Did he?
Pausing confusedly.
I did not see him,
returned Miss Recompense quietly.
I was not in company trim, and he asked for Doris. I dare say he thought her a young lady.
Is he staying in Boston?
Fingering the card irresolutely.
He was to return to Washington at once. He had come on some urgent business.
Mr. Adams went to his study. He looked at the address some moments before he broke the seal, but he found the first lines reassuring.
Will you have supper now?
Asked Miss Recompense from the doorway.
If convenient, yes.
He laid down his letter and came out in the hall.
Doris told you all her news, I suppose?
She read me her letter. Cary seems to be in good spirits and position. He spoke very highly of Lieutenant Hawthorne.
The account seems very satisfactory.
Then they went out to the quiet supper. A meal was not the same without Doris. All the evening he had remained in his room, reading his son's letter more than once and lapsing into deep thought over it. He heard the greetings now and came out inquiring after the folks in Sudbury Street, sitting down on the step and listening with evident pleasure to Doris's eager chat. It was bedtime when they dispersed.
Uncle Win,
Doris said the next morning.
There's a page in my letter I would like you to read. And do you think I might go home with Eudora and take dinner at Madame Royall's? Cary sent them some messages.
Yes, child,
he made answer. They were indeed very glad, but like Betty, they could not help wishing he had been on the famous Constitution. Alice was particularly interested and said she should watch the career of the United States. After that, the ice seemed broken, and no one hesitated to mention Cary, but Mr. Winthrop said to Doris,
My dear child, will you give me this leaf of your letter? I know Cary did not mean it for my eyes, but it is very precious to me. Doris, how comes it that you find the way to everybody's heart?
And you will forgive him, Uncle Win? He was so brave.
Her voice trembled.
I have forgiven him, Doris. If I should never see him again, you are young and most likely will, assure him there never was a moment that I ceased to love him. Perhaps I have not taken as much pains to understand him as I might. I suppose different influences act upon the new generation. If we should both live to welcome him back.
Oh, we must, Uncle Win.
If he has you.
Well, what was he saying?
You will both have me. I shall stay here always.
He stooped and kissed her. The other alternative, that Cary might not return, they banished resolutely, but it drew them nearer together in unspoken sympathy. Everybody noted how thin and frail-looking Mr. Adams had grown. Doris became his constant companion. She had a well-trained horse now, and they rode a good deal. Or they walked down Washington Street, where there were some pretty shops, and met promenaders. They sauntered about Cornhill, where Uncle Win picked up now and then an odd book, and they discovered strange things that had belonged to the old Boston of 100 years agone. There was quite an art gallery in Cornhill kept by Doggett and Williams, the nucleus of great things to come. It was quite the fashion for young ladies to drop in and exercise their powers of budding criticism or love of art. Now and then somebody lent a portrait of Smymarth's or Copley's, or you found some fine German or English engravings. An elder person generally accompanied the younger people. The law students, released from their labors, or the young society men, would walk home beside the chaperone, but talk to the maidens. Then Uncle Winthrop committed a piece of great extravagance, everybody said, especially in such times as these, when the British might take and destroy Boston. This was buying a pianoforte. Madame Royall approved, for Doris was learning to play very nicely. An old German musician, Gottlieb Graupner, who was quite a visitor at the Royall house, had imported it for a friend who had been nearly ruined by war troubles, and was compelled to part with it. Mr. Graupner and a knot of musical friends used to meet Saturday evenings in Old Pond Street. With a few instruments made a sort of orchestra. As a very great favor, friends were occasionally invited in. There was a new organist at Trinity Church, a Mr. Jackson, who was trying to bring in the higher class cathedral music. The choir of Park Street Church, some 50 in number, was considered one of the great successes of the day, and people flocked to hear it. Puritan music had been rather doleful and depressing. There was quite a discussion as to where the piano should stand. They had very little call to use the parlor in winter. Uncle Winthrop's friends generally visited him in the study. The spacious hall was the ordinary living room, and Doris begged that it might be kept there, for the winter at least. Oh, what a cheerful sound the music made in the old house! Uncle Win would bring out a book of poems, often Milton's L'Allegro, and half read, half listen to the entrancing combination. Dinah declared,
"It was like the voice of the angel Gabriel himself."
Miss Recompense enjoyed the grand old hymns that brought back her childhood. Solomon at first made a vigorous protest. He seemed jealous of the pretty fingers gliding over the keys, and would spring up to cover them or rest on her arms. But when he found he was banished to the kitchen every evening, he began to consider and presently gave in. He would sit beside Uncle Win in dignified protest, looking very dour, as the Scotchman would say. And then the country was electrified with the news of another great victory. Off the Canary Islands, Captain Decatur, with the frigate United States, met the Macedonian, one of the finest of the British fleet. The fight had been at close quarters with terrific broadsides, and after an hour and a half, with her fighting force disabled, the Macedonian struck her colors. Her loss in men killed and wounded was over 100, and the United States lost 5 killed and 7 wounded. The American vessel brought her prize and prisoners into port amid general acclaim. The Macedonian was repaired and added to the fast increasing navy that was rapidly winning a world-wide reputation. and when she came up to New York early in January with the compliments of the season, there was great rejoicing. Samuel Woodworth, printer and poet, wrote the song of the occasion, and Calvert, another poet, celebrated the event in an ode. Captain Carden was severely censured by his own government, as Captain Dacres had been, for not going down with flying colors instead of allowing his flag to be captured and his ship turned to the enemy's advantage. Instead of jeering at the Navy of pine boards and striped buntings, it was claimed the American vessels were of superior size and armament, and met the British at unfair advantage, and that they were largely manned by English sailors. There was an enthusiastic note from Cary. He was well, and it had been a glorious action. Captain Carden had been a brave gentleman, and he said regretfully,
"Oh, why do we have to fight these heroic men?"
But Betty had the letter of triumph this time. Mrs. King was a delightful correspondent, though she was always imploring Betty to join her. There had been a ball and reception given to several naval officers who were soon to go away. The President, engaged with some weighty affairs, had not come in yet, but the Secretary of Navy, Mr. Hamilton, and no end of military and naval men in gold lace and epaulets and gleaming swords were presented, and beautiful, enthusiastic women in shimmering silks and laces. One did not have to get a new gown for every occasion in those days. There was a little lull in the dancing. Mrs. Madison, who was charmingly affable, was seated with a group of men about her, when there was a stir in the hall, and a sudden thrill of expectancy quivered through the apartment. Ensign Hamilton, son of the Secretary, and several midshipmen entered, and the young man went straight to his father with the captured flag of the Macedonian. Such a cheer as rent the air! Ladies wiped their eyes and then waved their handkerchiefs in the wild burst of joy. They held the flag over the heads of the chief officer while the band played Hail Columbia. Then it was laid at the feet of Mrs. Madison, who accepted it in the name of the country with a charming and graceful speech. Afterward it was festooned on the wall with the flag of the Guerrière.
"So, you see, Cary has been the hero of a great victory,"
said Betty enthusiastically.
"But we all wish it had been off Boston Light instead of on the distant ocean. And it is a shame not to be in Washington. Electa seems to be going everywhere and seeing everything, in spite of her being the mother of 4 children, as Aunt Priscilla says. And the ladies dress so beautifully. We shall come to be known as plain Boston presently."
There was no Worth or Pingat to charge enormous prices. Patterns were passed around. Ladies went visiting and took their sleeves along to make, or their ruffles to plait, and altered over their brocades and paduasoys and crepes, and some darned Brussels footing until it was transformed into really handsome lace. They could clean their feathers and ribbons, and one wonders how they found time for so many things. They were very good letter writers, too. Dolly Madison and Mrs. Adams are fresh and interesting today. But Boston could rejoice, nevertheless. To the little girl, Cary was invested with the attributes of a hero. He even looked different to her enchanted eyes. Uncle Win used to smile with grave softness when she chattered about him. At first it had given him a heartache to hear Cary's name mentioned, but now it was like a strain of comforting music. Only he wondered how he would ever have lived without the little girl from old Boston. She used to play and sing Hail Columbia, for people were patriotic then, but the sweetest of all were the old-fashioned ones that his wife had sung as a young girl, daintily tender love songs. Sometimes he tried them with her, but his voice sounded to himself like a pale ghost out of the past, yet it still had a mournful sweetness. But with the rejoicing we had many sorrows. Our northern frontier warfare had been full of defeats. 1813 opened with various misfortunes. Ports were blockaded, business dropped lower and lower. Still social life went on, and in a tentative way intellectual life was making some progress. The drama was not neglected either. The old Boston Theater gave several stirring representations that today would be called quite realistic. One was the capture of the Guerrière, with officers, sailors, and marines, and songs that aroused drooping patriotism. Perhaps the young people at that time enjoyed it as much as their grandchildren did HMS Pinafore. Doris liked the rare musical entertainments. People grew quite used to seeing Mr. Winthrop Adams with a pretty, bright, growing girl who might have been his daughter. It was a delight to her when anyone made the mistake. Occasionally an old gentleman remembered her grandfather and the little boy Charles who went to England. Then in the early summer Mrs. King came on for a visit, and brought her eldest child, Bessie, a bright, well-trained little girl. There had been a great deal of trouble at the Mannings, and grandmother had gone back and forth, making it very confining for Betty. Crops had proved poor in the autumn. The children had the measles, and Mrs. Manning had a run of fever. Elizabeth had taken a cold in the early fall, and had a troublesome cough all winter. Mrs. Leverett wanted to bring her home for a rest, but Mrs. Manning could not spare her, with all the summer work, and the warm weather would set her up, she was quite sure. The country was drawing a brief breath of relief. There had been the magnificent victories on the lakes and some on the land, and now and then came cheering news of naval successes. Everybody was in better spirits. Mrs. King seemed to bring a waft of hope from the capital itself, and the Leverett house was quite enlivened with callers. Invitations came in for dinners and suppers and evening parties. Madame Royall quite claimed on her the strength of the Adams relation, and also Doris, who was such a favorite. Doris and little Bessie fraternized at once and practiced a duet for the entertainment of Uncle Winthrop, who praised them warmly. She planned to take Betty back to New York with her.
"But I can't go,"
declared Betty.
"Warren must not be taxed any more heavily, so there would be no hope of having help, and Mother cannot be left alone."
Is there any objection to Mercy coming? Why doesn't Warren marry? That would relieve you all. I suppose it is best for young people to have a home by themselves, but if it isn't possible, and I'd like to know how we are going to get along in heaven if we can't agree with each other here on earth,
Mrs. King inquired.
"That sounds like Father,"
said Betty laughingly, yet the tears came to her eyes.
"Poor Father! He did not suppose we would have such hard times. If the war would only end. You see,"
after a pause,
"we are not quite sure of Aunt Priscilla. She's changed and softened wonderfully, and she and Mother get along so well. She insisted upon paying a generous board, and she was good to Warren."
I must talk it over with Mother. There is no need of having your life spoiled, Betty.
For Betty was a very well-looking girl, arch and vivacious, and her harvest time of youth must not be wasted. Mrs. King was really glad she had no entanglement. Mrs. Leverett had no objections to a speedy marriage, if Mercy could be content. Warren had thought if he could be prosperous he would like to buy out Betty's share if she married, and my share will be mine as long as I live, added the mother. But Warren is fond of the old house, and Hollis has a home of his own. You girls will never want it. Warren was delighted with what he called Lecty's spunk, for Aunt Priscilla agreed quite readily. It was dull for Betty with two old people. Mercy would have her husband. So the wedding day was appointed. Mercy had been a year getting ready. Girls began soon after they were engaged. Mrs. Gilman was rather afraid the thing wouldn't work, but she was sure Mercy was good-tempered and she had been a good daughter. They made quite a turning round. Mrs. Leverett went upstairs to Betty's room, which adjoined Aunt Priscilla's, and she gave some of her furniture for the adornment of the bridal chamber. It was a very quiet wedding with a few friends and a supper. At 9 o'clock the new wife went to Sudbury Street. Mrs. Gilman had some rather strict ideas, and declared it was no time for frolicking when war was at our very door, and no one knew what might happen, and hundreds of families were in pinching want. Mercy was up in the next morning betimes and assisted her new mother with the breakfast. Warren went down to his shop, but they had quite an elaborate tea-drinking at the Leveretts and some songs and games in the evening. Mercy did enjoy the wider life. Mrs. Manning had come in for the wedding, and for a few days' stay, though she didn't see how she could be spared just now, and things would get dreadfully behind. Mrs. King was to go home with her and make a little visit. Bessie thought she would rather stay with Doris, and she was captivated with the Royall house and Eudora. The children never seemed in the way of the grown people there, and if elderly men talked politics and city improvements, quite visionary some thought them. The young people with Alice and Helen had the garden walks in the wide porch, and discussed the enjoyments of the time with the zest of enthusiastic inexperience but keen delight. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21. Elizabeth and Peace. Mrs. King brought back Elizabeth Manning, a pale, slim ghost of a girl, tall for her age, indeed really grown up, her mother said. Of the three girls, Bessie King had the most indications of the traditional country girl. A fine, clear skin, pink cheeks, and a plump figure, and an inexhaustible flow of spirits, ready for any fun or frolic. Doris was always well, but she had the Adams complexion, which was rather pale, with color when she was warm or enthusiastic or indignant. The pink came and went like a swift summer cloud.
"I do declare,"
exclaimed Aunt Priscilla,
"if Letty King doesn't beat all about getting what she wants and making other people believe they want it too. Warren might as well have been married in the winter, and Mercy would have been company for Betty. She never liked to run out and leave me alone. Mercy seems a nice, promising body, and Warren might as well be happy and settled as not. And Letty's been to Washington and dined with the President and Mrs. Madison, and I'll venture to say there was something the President's wife consulted her about. And all the big captains and generals and whatnot. And here's the quality of Boston running after her and asking her out just as if we had nothing to feed her on at home. She don't do anything for us to see, but just look smiling and talk. But my opinion is that Elizabeth Manning has on a very long journey to the graveyard. I don't see what Mary's been thinking about."
Mrs. King took her niece to Dr. Jackson, one of the best medical authorities of that day, and he looked the young girl over with his keen eyes.
"If you want the real truth,"
said the doctor,
"she has had too much east wind and too much hard work. The children of this generation are not going to stand what their mothers did. A bad cold or two next winter will finish her, but with care and no undue exposure she may live several years. But she will never reach the 70 that every human being has a right to."
Uncle Winthrop sent the carriage around every day to the Leveretts. They had given up theirs before Mr. Leverett's death. He and Doris took their morning horseback rides, and scoured the beautiful country places for miles around, until Doris knew every magnificent tree or unusual shrub or queer old house and its history. These hours were a great delight to him. Elizabeth had often gone down to Salem town, but her time was so brief and there was so much to do that she couldn't bother. She wondered how Doris knew about the shops in Essex Street and Federal Street, and Miss Russ's pretty millinery show, and Mr. John Ennis's delicate French rolls and braided bread, and Molly Sanders' gingerbread that the school children devoured, and the old Forester house with its legends and fine old pictures, and the lovely gardens, the wharves with their idle fleets that dared not put out to sea for fear of being swallowed up by the enemy. Uncle Winthrop had taken her several times when some business had called him thither, but, truth to tell, she had never cared to repeat her visit to Mrs. Manning's. The piano was a little bit of heaven, Elizabeth thought, the first time she came over to visit Doris.
"Oh,"
she said with a long sigh, pressing her hand on her heart, for the deep breaths always hurt her.
"if I was only prepared to go to heaven, I shouldn't want to stay here a day longer. When they sing about eternal rest, it seems such a lovely thing, and to lay your burdens down. But then there's the terrors of the law and the judgments to come and the great searching of the hearts and reins. Do you know just what the reins are?"
No, Doris didn't. Heaven had always seemed a lovely place to her, and God like a father, only grander and tenderer than any human father could be. Then they talked about praying, and it came out that Doris said her mother's prayers still in French and her father's in English.
"Oh!"
exclaimed Elizabeth, horrified.
"I shouldn't dare to pray to God in French. It would seem like a mockery. And 'Now I lay me down to sleep' is just a baby prayer, and really isn't pouring out your own soul to God.
Doris asked Uncle Winthrop about it.
My child,
he said with grave sweetness,
you can never say any better prayers of your own. The Saviour himself gave us the comprehensive Lord's Prayer. And are all the nations of the earth who cannot pray in English, offering God vain petitions? You will find, as you grow older, that no earnest soul ever worships God in vain, and that religion is a lifelong work. I am learning something new about it every day, and I think God means us to be happy here on earth. He doesn't save all the joys for heaven. He has given me one.
And he stooped and kissed Doris on the forehead.
Poor Elizabeth,
he added.
Make her as happy as you can.
When Mrs. King proposed to take Betty to New York for the whole of the coming winter, there was consternation, but no one could find a valid objection. It was a somewhat expensive journey, and winter was a very enjoyable season in the city. Then another year something new might happen to prevent. There was no time like the present. No one had the courage to object, though they did not know how to spare her. Aunt Priscilla sighed and brought out some beautiful, long-laid-away articles that Electa declared would make over admirably.
"Where do you suppose Aunt Priscilla picked up all these elegant things?"
asked Electa.
"I never remember seeing her wear them, though she always dressed well, but severely plain. And Uncle Perkins was quite strict about the pomps and vanities of the world."
And so Aunt Priscilla put away the last of her idols and the life she had coveted and never had. But perhaps the best of all was her consideration for others, the certainty that it was quite as well to begin some of the virtues of the heavenly world here on earth, that they might not seem strange to one. Mrs. Manning sent in for Elizabeth.
"Well, you do seem like a different girl,"
her father declared, looking her over from head to foot.
"You've had a good rest now, and you'll have to turn in strong and hearty, for Sarah's gone, and Ruth isn't big enough to take hold of everything. So hunt up your things while I'm doing some trading."
Elizabeth only had time for the very briefest farewells. Mrs. King sent a little note containing the doctor's verdict, but Mrs. Manning was indignant rather than alarmed. It was lonesome when they were all gone. Eudora Chapman went to a finishing school this autumn, and Doris accompanied her. Poor Doris, who had not mastered fractions and whose written arithmetic could not compare with Betty's. She had achieved a pair of stockings after infinite labor and trouble. They did look rowy, being knit tighter and looser, but Aunt Priscilla gave her a pair of fine merino that she had kept from the ravages of the moths. Miss Recompense declared that she had no one else to knit for. There were expert knitters who made beautiful silk stockings, and Uncle Winthrop said buying helped along trade, so why should Doris worry when there are so many more important matters? The little girl and her uncle kept track of what was going on in the great world. Napoleon the Invincible had been driven back from Russia by cold and famine, forced to yield by the great coalition, and losing step by step until he was compelled to accept banishment. Then England redoubled her efforts, prepared to carry on the war with us vigorously. Towns on the Chesapeake were plundered and burned, and General Ross entered Washington, from which Congress and the President's family had fled for their lives. America was again horror-stricken, but gathering all her energy, she made such a vigorous defense as to convince her antagonist that, though cast down, she could never be wholly defeated. But this attack gave us the inspiration of one of our finest deathless songs. A Mr. Francis S. Key, a resident of Georgetown, had gone down from Baltimore with a flag of truce to procure the release of a friend held as prisoner of war when the bombardment of Fort Henry began. All day long he watched the flag as it floated above the ramparts. Night came on, and it was still there, and at midnight he could see it only by the rocket's red glare, while he and his friends tremulously inquired if the flag still waved o'er the land of the free. Oh, what joy must have been his when it caught the gleam of the morning's first beam! He had put the night watch and the dawn in a song that is still an inspiration. And now convinced, the enemy withdrew. There were talks of peace, though we did not abate our energies, and the indications of a settlement brought about another wedding at the Royall house. Miss Alice had been a great favourite with the young men, and her ardent patriotism had inspired more than one, as it had Cary Adams, with a desire to rush to his country's defence. There were admirers too, but most of them had been kept at an intangible distance. At last she yielded to the eloquence of young Oliver Sargent, who was in every way acceptable. Grandmother Royall expected to give her an elegant wedding along in the winter. The government was to send out another commissioner to consult with those already at Ghent, and Mr. Sargent had been offered the post of private secretary. He was to sail from New York, but he obtained leave to spend a few days in Boston to attend to some affairs. He went at once to Madame Royall and laid his plans before her. He wanted to marry Alice and take her with him, as he might be gone a long while. Alice was nothing loath, for the journey abroad was extremely tempting. But what could one do in such a few days? And wedding clothes?
"Save the wedding gear until we come back,"
said the impatient young lover.
"Alice can get clothes enough abroad."
It was quite a new departure in a wedding. Invitations were sent out by hand, even for small evening parties, and often verbally given. A private marriage would not have suited old Madame Royall, so the house was crowded at 11 in the morning, and the bride came through the wide hall in a mulberry-coloured satin gown and pelisse that had been made 2 weeks before for ordinary autumn wear. But her bonnet was white, with long streamers, and her gloves were white, and she made a very attractive bride, while young Sargent was manly and looked proud enough for a king. At 12 they went away with no end of good wishes, and an old slipper was thrown after the carriage. Mrs. Morris Winslow had 2 babies, and was already growing stout, but the departure of Alice made a great break.
"But it is the way of the world and the way of God that young people should marry,"
said Madame Royall.
"I was very happy myself."
"Oh!"
exclaimed Doris eagerly that evening, her eyes aglow and her cheeks pink with excitement.
"Oh, Uncle Win, do you think there will be peace?"
"My girl, it is my prayer day and night."
"And then Cary will come home."
It had been a long while since they had heard. Cary had been transferred from the United States, that had lain blockaded in a harbor many weary weeks, but where he was now no one could tell. People began to take heart, though the fighting had not ceased, and it was odd that a dozen years before everybody had looked askance at dancing, and now no one hesitated to give a dancing party. The contra-dance and cotillions were all the rage. Sometimes there was great amusement when it was a draw dance, for then you had to accept your partner whether or no. Whole families went, grandmothers and grandchildren. There were cards and conversation circles for those who did not care to join the mazy whirls, and the suppers were quite elegant, with brilliant lamps and flowers, plate and glass that had come through generations. Fruits and melons were preserved as long as possible, and a Turkish band in fine oriental costume was often a feature of the entertainment. Doris had charming letters from Betty, a little stilted we should call them now, but very interesting. Mr. King was confident of peace. Doris used to read them to Aunt Priscilla, who said Betty was very frivolous, but that she always had a good time, and perhaps good times were not as wicked as people used to think. Mrs. Leverett went to Salem in November. Her namesake had taken a cold and had some fever, and she asked for grandmother continually. Mercy did finely at housekeeping, and so the weeks ran along, the invalid getting better, then worse, and just before Christmas the frail little life floated out to the land of rest.
"Oh, poor little Elizabeth,"
cried Doris.
"if she could have been real happy. But there never seemed any time. Uncle Win, they are not so poor that they have to work so hard, are they?"
"No, dear. Mr. Manning has money out at interest, besides his handsome farm. But a great many people think there is solid virtue in working and saving. I suppose it makes them happy."
Doris was puzzled. She said the same thing to Aunt Priscilla, who took off her glasses, rubbed them with a bit of old silk, and wiped the tears out of her eyes.
"I think we haven't had quite the right end of it,"
she began after a pause.
"I was brought up that way. But then people had to spin and weave for themselves and help the men, with the out-of-doors work. The children dropped corn and potatoes. Oh, and there was always weeding. There was so much spring work and fall work, and folks couldn't be comfortable if they saw a child playing cat's cradle. They did think Satan was going about continually to catch up idle hands. Well, maybe if I'd had children, I'd have done the same way.
Oh, you wouldn't, Aunt Priscilla, I know,
said Doris with the sweetest faith shining in her eyes.
Elizabeth thought you such a comfortable old lady. She said you never worried at anyone.
That is because I have come to believe the worrying wrong. The Lord didn't worry at people. He told them what to do, and then he let them alone. And Forrest Leverett was about the best man I ever knew. He didn't even worry when times were so bad. Everybody said his children would be spoiled. They were out sledding and sliding and skating and playing tag in summer. Oh, but they've made nice men and women.
Oh, I remember how friendly he looked that day he came on the vessel, and how he said to Captain Greer, "Is there a little girl for me that has come from old Boston?" He might have said something else, you know. A little girl for me was such a sweet welcome, I have never forgotten it.
Yes, I was here the night you came. We had been waiting. And the red cloak and big bonnet with the great bow under your chin and a silk frock.
Did I look very queer?
Doris laughed softly.
You looked like a picture, though that wasn't my idea of what children should be.
Miss Recompense has them put away to keep. I outgrew them, you know. What would you have done with me?
Aunt Priscilla's pale face wrinkled up and then smoothed out.
I've come to the conclusion the Lord knows his business best and is capable of attending to it. When we meddle, we make a rather poor fist of it. Betty has a lot of morning glories out there. And I said to her, "They're poor, frail things. Why not put up a hop vine or red beans? They can't stand a bit of sun, like Jonah's gourd." But she only laughed. Her father had that way when he didn't want to argue. When they came to bloom, they were sights to behold. Like the early morning when the sun is rising, and you see such beautiful colors. They used to nod to each other and swing back and forth, like people coming to call. Then they said goodbye and were off. The Lord meant 'em just to look pretty, and they did.
Uncle Win likes them so much. Miss Recompense had a whole lattice full of them. Oh, did you mean I was like a morning glory? Haven't I some other uses?
You're always fresh and blossoming every day. That's a use. You come in here with a little greeting that warms one's heart. You are a great delight to Uncle Leverett, and I don't know what Uncle Winthrop would have done without you, Cary being away. And how Solomon took to you, when he was awful shy of strangers. He must have liked you uncommon to be willing to stay in a strange place, for cats cannot bear to be moved about. Maybe 'twould been the same if you had not been so pretty to look at, but the Lord made you the way he wanted you, and you haven't spoiled yourself a bit.
Doris blushed. Compliments were quite a new thing with Aunt Priscilla.
What would you have done with me?
Doris asked again, after a long pause.
You don't want to hear it. I ought to confess it, because it was a sin, a sort of meddling with the Lord's plans. You see, I'd taken it in my head that someone would have to give you a home. It didn't seem as if that old marshland would be good for anything, and I knew your father wasn't rich. Winthrop Adams was one of the finicky kind, and quite put about to know what to do with you. So I thought, if there didn't any place open, for Elizabeth Leverett was quite wrapped up in her grandchildren, that,
hesitatingly,
when things were straightened out a bit, I'd offer.
That would have been good of you.
No, it wasn't goodness,
interrupted Aunt Priscilla.
I thought I should want someone with Polly getting old. I'd have expected you to work, though I'd have done the fair thing by you and left you some money in the end. I was a little jealous when everybody took to you so. I was sure you'd be spoiled. And though you've got that music thing and go among the quality, and are pretty as a pink, and Winthrop Adams think you are a nonsuch. You come in here in plain, everyday fashion and talk and read and make it sunshiny for everybody. So you see, the Lord knew, and it is just as if he said, Priscilla Perkins, your way doesn't suit at all. There's something in the world besides work and saving money. There's room enough in the world for a hill of potatoes and a morning glory made of silk and dew. If it doesn't bloom but just one morning, it's a smile, and there are others to follow, and it is 1,000 times better than frowns.
And if there had been no money, and I had wanted a home, would you have given me one?
She asked in a soft, tremulous tone.
Yes, child, and I couldn't have worked you quite like poor little Elizabeth was worked. I didn't think there was so much money, or that lady in England would have left you a legacy, or that Winthrop Adams would come to believing that he couldn't live without you.
Then you were kind to have a plan about it, and I am glad to know it.
She had been sitting on Aunt Priscilla's footstool, but she rose and twined her arms about the shrunken neck and kissed the wrinkled forehead. She saw a homeless little girl going to sheltering care, with a kindly remembrance at the last. Someone else might have thought of the exactions.
Oh, you make the thing look better than it was.
Aunt Priscilla cried with true humility.
But the Lord put you in the right place.
She saw the mean and selfish desire, the wish to get rid of a faithful old woman who might prove a burden. It was a sin like the finery she had longed for and bought and laid away. She had not worn the finery. She had not sent away the poor black soul. She had not been a hard taskmistress to the child, but early training had added the weight of possible sins to the actual ones. Christmas morning Doris was surprised by a lovely gift. In a small box by her plate, with best wishes from Uncle Winthrop, lay a watch and chain, a dainty thing with just Doris on the plain space in the center that overlay another name that had once been there. It had undergone some renovation at the jeweler's hands, after lying untouched more than 20 years. Winthrop Adams had kept it for a possible granddaughter, but he knew now no one could cherish it more tenderly than Doris. January 1815 came in. People counted the days, but it was not until the middle of February that Boston town was one morning electrified by the ringing of bells and the shouts of men and boys, who ran along the streets crying, "Peace! Peace! Peace!" Windows were raised, people ran out, so eager were they. Of all the glorious words ever uttered, none fell with such music on the air. Could it be true? Uncle Winthrop put on his surtout with a great fur collar. Then he looked at Doris.
"Wrap yourself up and come along,"
he said huskily. Already people were hanging flags out of the windows and stringing them across the streets. Every sled and sleigh had some sort of banner, if nothing more than white or brown paper with the 5 welcoming letters, and everybody was shouting. Some men were carrying high banners with the words in blue or red on a white ground. When they came to State Street, it was impassable. Cornhill was jammed. The Evening Gazette office had the announcement, 32 hours from New York. There was no telegraph or railroad train then. "Sir, I hasten to acquaint you for the information of the public of the arrival here this afternoon of His Britannic Majesty's sloop of war Favorite, in which has come passenger Mr. Carroll, American messenger, having in his possession a treaty of peace." They passed that word from the nearest, standing by the bulletin, to the farther circles, and in 5 minutes the crowd knew it by heart. On the commons the drums were beating, the cannons firing, and people shouting themselves hoarse. Mr. Adams went around to the Royall house, and that looked like a hotel on a gala day, and it was nearly as full of people. The treaty had been signed on Christmas Eve. The President had now to issue a decree suspending hostilities, but one of the most brilliant battles had been fought on the 8th of January at New Orleans under General Jackson, a farewell shot. For a week no one could think or talk of anything else. Then, the official accounts having been received from Washington, there were plans for a grand procession. An oratorio was given at the stone chapel in the morning. Madame Royall had managed to obtain seats for Mr. Winthrop and Doris with her party. The church was crowded. American and British officers in full uniform were side by side, as happy to be at peace as the rulers themselves, chatting cordially with each other. The State House was decorated with transparencies, and there were to be fireworks in the evening. The procession marched around the common, with the different trades drawn on sleds. Printers struck off handbills with the word peace printed on them, and distributed them among the crowd. The carpenters were erecting a temple of peace. The papermakers had long strips of red, white, and blue. Every trade had hit upon some signification of the general joy. Uncle Win sent Cato round for Mercy and Warren Leverett to come to tea, and then they went out to see the illumination and the fireworks. Old Boston had suffered a great deal from the war, and her rejoicing was as broad as her sorrow had been deep. As if that was not enough, there was to be a grand peace ball. The gentry did not so often patronize public balls, but this was an exception. Uncle Winthrop procured a ticket for Warren and his wife. Mrs. Gilman was shocked, and Mercy, like a modern woman, declared she had nothing to wear. But Aunt Priscilla brought out her last remnant of gorgeousness, a gray satin that looked very youthful draped with sheer white.
I feel just as if I was going to be married over again,
Mercy declared laughingly, and Warren said she had never looked so beautiful. Uncle Winthrop left Doris's adornments to Madame Royall and Mrs. Chapman. She and Eudora had the same kind of gowns, sheer, knotted muslin, trimmed with rows of white satin ribbon, and the bodice with frills of lace and bows of ribbon. The hairdresser did her hair in a multitude of puffs and curls that made her look quite like a young lady. She was still very slim, but growing tall rapidly. In fact, as Uncle Winthrop looked at her, he realized that she could not always remain a little girl. The concert hall was brilliantly illuminated and decorated with flags and flowers. A platform surrounded the floor, and many people preferred to be spectators or just join in the march. There were some naval as well as military officers, and Doris kept a sharp watch, for it almost seemed as if she might come upon Cary. Oh, where would he hear the declaration of peace? The dancing was quite delightful to most of the young people. Even those who just walked about looked happy, and the little knots chatted and smiled, adding a certain interest to the scene. The supper was very fine, and after that many of the quality retired, leaving the floor to those who had come to dance. Doris looked bright the next morning as she came to breakfast in her blue flannel frock and lace tucker, and her hair tied up high with a red ribbon, which, with her white skin,
made the American colors,
Helen Chapman said.
I am glad to get back my little girl,
Uncle Winthrop exclaimed, as he placed his hands lightly on her shoulders.
You looked strange to me last night. Doris, how tall you are growing.
In half surprise.
That is an Adam's trait, Aunt Priscilla would say. And do you remember that I am 15?
Isn't there some way that girls can be set back?
He asked with feigned anxiety.
I've heard of their being set back after they reached 30 or 40,
said Miss Recompense.
I don't want to wait so long,
returned Uncle Winthrop with a smile.
There were some beautiful old ladies there last night,
said Doris.
The one with black velvet and diamonds, Madame Boudon. Is that Aunt Priscilla's friend?
I suppose so. Mr. Perkins was held in high esteem, and Aunt Priscilla used to go about in her carriage then.
And Madame Scott, Uncle Win, to think she was John Hancock's wife, and he signed the Declaration of Independence.
And after that I wouldn't have married anybody,
declared Miss Recompense with haughty stiffness. The enthusiasm did not die out at once. When men or women met, they had to talk over the good news. Warren Leverett declared that business was reviving. Mercy told Uncle Winthrop that she had never expected to see so many famous people under such grand conditions as a peace ball, and that it would be something to talk about when she was an old lady. Aunt Priscilla listened to the accounts with deep interest.
And I looked like a real young lady,
said Doris.
I was frightened when I came to think about it. I would like to stay a little girl for years and years, but I would not have missed the ball for anything. I do not believe there will ever be such a grand occasion again.
End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 22. Cary Adams. It took a good while in those days for the news of peace to go around the world, but there was a general reign of peace. The European countries had mostly settled their difficulties. There was royalty proper again on the throne of France. Napoleon swept through his 100 brilliant days, and was banished for life to the rocky isle of St. Helena. The young king of Rome was a virtual prisoner to Austria, and Russia and Prussia began to breathe freely once more. The United States had won a standing among the nations. Her indomitable courage, her successes against tremendous odds, had impressed Europe with her vitality and determination. One by one the ships came back at home ports. Mr. Adams and Doris watched and listened to every bit of news eagerly. The old apothecary shop on Washington Street, to begin a famous story a decade later as the old corner bookstore, was even then a rendezvous for the news of the day. People paused going up and down, and each one added his bit to the general fun, or took with him the knowledge he was eagerly seeking. And when someone said, "Heard from your son yet, Mr. Adams?" he could only make a negative gesture.
If there isn't some word of Cary Adams soon, his father will never live to welcome him home,
said Madame Royall to her daughter.
He grows thinner every day. What a perfect godsend Doris has been.
Madame Royall was hale and hearty, though she had lived through many sorrows. The coveted news came first from Betty. She had written a letter to send by a private messenger, and opened it to add this postscript.
Mr. Bowen is waiting for this letter. Mr. King has just come in with the news that 2 ships have arrived at Portsmouth. Among the officers is Lieutenant Cary Adams. That is all we know.
Oh, Uncle Win.
Doris's eyes swam in tears of joy.
Read Betty's postscript.
Then she ran out of the room and had a good cry by herself, though why anyone should want to cry over such joyful news she could not quite understand. Afterward she tied on her hat and ran over to Madame Royall's, and then up to Sudbury Street, for in those days people were wont to say to their neighbors, "Come, rejoice with me." When she returned home the house was very quiet. Solomon came and rubbed against her in mute inquiry. No one was in the study. She went out to the kitchen.
"Don't disturb your uncle, Doris,"
said Miss Recompense.
"The news quite overcame him. He has gone to lie down."
After dinner she went out again for some lessons. Oh, how bright the world looked, though it was a day in later March, but the wind had a southern softness. Soon the wild flowers would be out. There was a very interesting new study, botany, that the previous autumn had taken groups of girls out in the lanes and fields, and some had ventured to visit the botanic gardens at Harvard University. Doris was very much interested in it. Uncle Winthrop came to supper, and Doris played and sang for him during the evening. For though Cary was the uppermost thought in both hearts, they could not talk about him. It was a tedious post journey from Washington to Boston. One had to possess one's soul and patience, but the letter came at length. Cary had to go to Washington, as there was some prize money and claims to be inquired into. He had handed in his resignation, and should hereafter be a private citizen of dear old Boston. There was much more that gladdened his father's heart and betrayed a manly spirit. Betty returned home, though Mrs. King declared she only lent her for a visit. She was very stylish now, and was studying French, for it might be possible that Mr. King would go abroad and take his wife and Betty.
"I do wonder if you will ever settle down,"
exclaimed Mrs. Leverett anxiously. That meant marriage and housekeeping. Betty laughed.
"You know I have settled to be the old maid aunt,"
she returned.
"but I am going to have a good young time first. And, Mother, you can hardly realize what a fine, generous, broad-minded man Matt King has made."
There were lovely odds and ends of attire, dainty slippers, long gloves that came to your very shoulders, Vandyke capes of beautiful lace, buckles that looked like diamonds, ribbons and belts and sashes. Mercy said Betty could go down to Washington Street and open a fancy goods store. And oh, the delightful things she had seen and done, the skating parties in the winter, the sleigh rides when one stopped at a cozy, well-kept tavern and had a dainty supper and a dance. the drives down around the Battery and Bowling Green, and the promenades. There were still a good many military men in New York, but it had not suffered as much from the war as Boston. But Boston was growing beautiful by the hour, with her pretty private gardens and hundreds of fruit trees blooming everywhere, and the great common where people went for walks on sunny afternoons. Miss Recompense had a gorgeous tulip bed and some lilies of the valley, which were quite a new thing. Cato trimmed and trained the roses and vines, and the old Adams house was quite a bower of beauty. One April afternoon Doris sat by the study window doing some lace work, while Solomon lay curled up on the sill. She kept glancing out. People were quite given to going around this corner to get into Common Street. She liked to see them. Now and then a friend nodded. Uncle Win had been reading aloud from Jerusalem Delivered, but Doris thought it rather prosy, and strayed off into her own thoughts. A tall, soldierly fellow came up the street, looked, hesitated, opened the gate softly, and glanced down at the tulips. He was quite imposing as to figure, and his complexion was bronzed, the ends of his brown hair rather long and curling. He was in citizen clothes, and Doris wondered why she should think of Lieutenant Hawthorne. She had expected Cary in all the glory of a naval uniform, a slim, fair, boyish person with a light, springy walk. It never could be Cary.
"Oh, Uncle Win, quick!"
as the step sounded on the porch.
"It is someone."
She was so little certain she could not utter a name. Uncle Winthrop went out, opened the door, and his son put his arms around his father's neck. If there had been need of words, neither could have uttered them for many minutes. When Miss Recompense cleaned house a week or two before the piano had been moved into the parlor, the door stood open so that it could have the warmth of the hall fire. The two entered it when they found their voices.
"It is Cary,"
thought Doris, with a sense of disappointment, though why she could not have told. Half an hour afterward they came out to the study.
"Oh, Doris!"
Cary cried.
"How you have changed and grown! I shouldn't have known you. I've been carrying about me with the remembrance of a little girl. In my mind you have been no taller, no older, and yet I might have known. Why, we shall have to get acquainted all over again."
Doris blushed.
"I am sure I have not changed as much as you. I did not think it could be you."
Someone at Annapolis before we went out designated me that consumptive-looking young fellow. But I have grown strong and hearty, and no doubt I shall come to 80. I do not mean that it shall be all labor and sorrow either.
Then Cary made the rounds of the house. Miss Recompense was as much amazed as Doris had been. Cato and Dinah were overjoyed. He had hardly dared dream that nothing would be changed, that more than the old love would be given back. He had gone away a boy, nurtured in the restraints of wise Puritanism that made a lasting mark on New England character. He had come home a man of experience, of deeper thought, of higher understanding and stronger affection. He was proud that he had done his duty as a citizen of the Republic, but he knew that neither naval or military life was to his taste. Henceforth he was to be a son in the old home. Doris left them talking when she went to bed, a little hurt and jealous that she was no longer first, that she could not be all to Uncle Win. It gave her a kind of solitary feeling. The old house took on an aspect of intense interest. There was a continual going and coming, and enough congratulations for a wedding feast. All Cary's friends vied with each other in warm welcomes, and Madame Royall claimed him with the old-time cordiality. Was there any disappointment about Alice? He had a boy's thought the first months about winning glory for her, of coming back to her, and perhaps laying his triumphs at her feet. But the real work, the anxieties, the solemn fact of taking one's life in one's hands, and realizing how near death might be, had changed him month by month, until he had only one prayer left, that he might see his father again. If she was happy, she surely had her heart's choice. He was satisfied. They had never really been lovers. When the first excitement of welcome was over, there were many things to think about. His interrupted career was one. Governor Gore had been chosen United States Senator the year before, but he still kept his office, and very kindly greeted the return of his student, offering him still greater advantages. Here the young Daniel Webster, a lad fresh from the country, had won the friendship of his master, and after a brief trial in New Hampshire had returned to Boston. Boston town began to experience the beneficent power of peace. Languishing industries revived. Commerce had been crippled by the war, but the inhabitants of New England had learned the value of their own ingenuity and industry to supply needs, and now they were roused to the fact that there was an outside world to supply as well. Improvement started up on every side. There was even talk of transforming the town into a city. Indeed, it had never been a formally incorporated town. The Court of Assistants, 170 years before, had changed the name from Tri-Mountain to Boston, and it had taken the privileges of a town, but there were many grave questions coming to the front. The family party at the Adams house this year seemed to include half of Boston. One by one the old relatives had dropped out. Some of the younger ones had gone to other cities. Madame Royall came over to be mistress of ceremonies, for besides the ovation to the returned lieutenant, Miss Doris Adams was to be presented as a full-fledged young lady, and she wore her pretty gown made for the Peace Ball, and pink roses. Miss Betty Leverett was quite a star as well. Miss Helen Chapman was engaged, and Eudora was a favorite with the young gentlemen.
"I shall be so sorry when they are all gone,"
declared Madame Royall.
"I do love young people, but I am afraid my fourth generation will not grow up in time for me to enjoy them. You must keep good watch over Doris, lest some wolf enters the fold and carries off the sweet child."
Uncle Win smiled and then looked grave. Doris carried off? Oh no, he could never spare her. Cary Adams had not forgotten how to dance, and every girl he asked was delighted with the opportunity. It seemed rather queer to Doris to accept her decline on her own responsibility. A week or two later, when they had settled to quite regular living, Cary came out and sat on the step one evening.
"Doris," he
began,
"do you remember the letter I sent you by Lieutenant Hawthorne? That first letter?"
What a flood of remembrances it brought.
"Oh, yes."
She had begun to feel very much at home with Cary, his little sister as he called her.
"And I must tell you a queer thing. The day you came home, when I looked down the path, I thought of him. You had changed so. I don't know what sent him to my mind."
"That was odd. He is in town. He called on me today. For the last year he has been Captain Hawthorne, and he is a splendid fellow. He has been sent to Charleston Navy Yard, and may be here the next 3 months. For now the government is considering a navy. Well, we did some splendid fighting with the old ships, but oh, Doris, you can't imagine how homesick I was. I had half a mind to show the white feather and come home."
"Oh, you couldn't have done it, Cary."
"No, I couldn't when it came to the pinch. But if I had gone with father's consent, I understood then what it would be never to see him again. I think I shall be a better son all my life for the lesson."
"Yes,"
in her gentle, approving fashion.
"Hawthorne wants to come over here,"
Cary said presently.
"I think my father would like him, though I notice he has an aversion to military or naval men. But I shall never go away again, unless the country is in great danger."
"I should like to see him. I wonder if he has changed as much as you."
"I think not."
And Cary laughed.
"He was 24 then, and sort of settled into manhood, while I was a rather green stripling."
"You are losing some of the sea tan, as Madame Royall calls it. I am glad of it. I like you best fair."
"Captain Hawthorne is a very handsome man. I ought to feel flattered to be mistaken for him."
"Is he?"
returned Doris simply.
"Don't you remember him?"
"I remember that he asked me for a rose, and I gave it to him. It was the last one on the bush. I was so glad to get the letter, I couldn't think of anything else."
So Cary brought him over to tea one afternoon. Doris noted then that he was extremely good-looking and very entertaining. Besides, he had a fine tenor voice, and they sang songs together. Uncle Winthrop was troubled at first. Captain Hawthorne's enthusiasm for his profession was so ardent that Mr. Adams was alarmed lest it might turn Cary's thoughts seaward again. But he found presently that Cary's enlisting had been that of a patriotic, high-spirited boy, and that he had no real desire for the life. What a summer it was! Betty was over often. Eudora was enchanted with the Adams house, and there was a bevy of girls who brought their sewing and spent the afternoon on the stoop. Sometimes Uncle Win came out and read to them. There were several New English poets. A Lord Byron was writing the cantos of a beautiful and stirring poem entitled Childe Harold, that abounded in fine descriptions. There were the Lady of the Lake and Marmion, and there was a queer Scotchy poet by the name of Burns who had a dry wit, and few could master the tongue. A whole harvest of delight was coming over from England. There were so many curious and lovely places within a few hours' sail or drive. Captain Hawthorne had spent most of his life in Maryland, and the scenery was new. They made up parties for the day, or Betty, Doris, and Uncle Winthrop and the captain went in a quartet.
I don't know,
Uncle Win said one day with a grave shake of the head.
Do you not think I am rather an old fellow to go careering round with you young people?
But, you see, someone would have to go,
explained Doris.
Young ladies can't go out with a young man alone. It would have to be Aunt Elizabeth or Mrs. Chapman, and I would so much rather have you. It's nice to be just by ourselves.
The captain seems to like Betty very much.
Indeed he does,
answered Doris warmly. Occasionally Cary would get off and join them, but he was trying hard to catch up. He had gotten out of study habits, and some days he found it quite irksome, for he was fond of pleasure, and it seemed to him that Betty was extremely charming, and Doris quaint, and Eudora vivacious to the point of wit. One warm August afternoon he sat alone, having resolved to master a knotty point. What were the others doing, he wondered. There was a step, and he glanced up.
Oh!
Nodding to Captain Hawthorne.
I was just envying you and all the others, and wondering where you were on, pleasure-bound.
It was not pleasure, but hard work over at the yard today. However, I have the evening, and feel like inviting myself to partake of a cup of the comforting tea Miss Recompense brews.
Come along, then. I have put in a good day, and am conscience clear.
Cary began to pile up his books.
I have only about a fortnight more.
Captain Hawthorne said slowly. Cary changed his coat and locked his desk.
Well?
As the caller was watching him earnestly.
Adams, do you expect to marry your cousin?
Hawthorne asked abruptly.
My cousin? Betty or Doris?
Doris.
Why, no, I never thought of it. And I have a sight of work to do before I marry.
Then, I suppose you've never suspected such a thing, but I am in love with her.
In love with Doris? Why, she's just a child.
I dare say. I shall have to serve 7 years before I can get your father's consent. She will be older then. I was listening to a romantic story about an old house where a handsome girl leaned out of a window and her beauty attracted an English officer passing by, who said to himself that was the woman for him. Long afterward he went back, found her, and married her.
A handsome mischief, yes.
Cary smiled.
See here, Cary Adams.
Hawthorne took a small leather case out of his pocket. Between 2 cards was a pressed rose.
When I took your packet to Miss Doris Adams almost 4 years ago, I gave it into the hands of the sweetest little girl I ever saw. If I had been less of a gentleman, I must have kissed her. I espied one rose in the garden and asked her for it. This is the rose she gave me. I meant to come north and find her, and when I asked for leave of absence to visit Boston, this business was put in my charge. Then I said, I will look up the little girl, who must be a large girl now, and woo her with the sincerest regard. It shall go hard indeed with me if I cannot win her, but I have fancied of late that you—
She is very dear to me, and to my father, but I had not thought.
Then I take my chances. As I said, I will wait for her. She is still very young, and I should feel conscience smitten to rob your father. Some time you may want to bring the woman you love to the old home, and then it will not be so hard. I could keep true to her the whole world over, and if she promises, she will keep true to me.
Cary Adams was deeply moved. Such devotion ought to win a reward. How blind he and his father had been, thinking of Betty Leverett. Oh, how could they let Doris go? Yet a lover like this was not to be curtly refused.
I shall not stand in your way.
Quietly.
Thank you 1,000 times. But if she had been for you, as I feared, I should have proved man enough to keep silent and go my way. It has been a happy summer, and in 2 weeks more it will end. Still, I may be able to get an appointment here. I shall try for it and return.
Come,
said Cary Adams, and he went out feeling that there had been a great change in the world, and he was wrapped about with some mysterious influence. Doris had thought of Captain Hawthorne on this day of his, Cary's, return. How many times beside had she thought of him? And she had recalled giving him the rose. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 23. The Cost of Womanhood. A happy fortnight. It was worth all the afterpain to have it to remember. When Boston was a great city half a century later, and there had been another war, and Captain Hawthorne had risen in the ranks and been put on the retired list, he came a grizzled old man to find the place that had always lived in his remembrance. But the old house had been swept away by the march of improvement. The rounding corner straightened and given over to business, and the common was magnificent in beauty. The tall, thin, scholarly man had gone to the wife of his youth. Doris, little Doris, was very happy, so what did it matter? There was a succession of lovely days. One morning early, Captain Hawthorne joined Doris and her uncle in a long ride over on Boston Neck. They found an odd old tavern kept by a sailor who'd been round the world and taken a hand in the scrimmage, as he called it, and with his small prize money bought out the place. There was some delightful bread and cold chicken, wine and bottled cider equal to champagne. There was another long, lovely day when, with Betty, they went up to Salem and drove around the quaint streets and watched the signs of awakening business. There was Fort Pickering, the lighthouse out on the island, the pretty common, the East India Marine Society's hall with its curiosities, quite wonderful even then, and the clean streets with their tidy shops, the children coming from school, the housewives going about on errands. Foster Manning drove his grandmother down to join them, and he was almost a young man now. He told Doris they all missed Elizabeth so much, but he was glad she had had that nice visit to Boston. So the days drifted on, Doris unconsciously sweet in her simplicity, yet so innocent that the lover began to fear while he hoped. Uncle Winthrop had gone to a meeting of the Historical Society. Miss Recompense had a neighbor in great trouble that she was trying to console out in the supper-room, where they could talk unreservedly. Cary was in the study, and the two were sauntering around the fragrant walks where the grassy beds had recently been cut. There was no moon, and the whole world seemed soft and still, as if it was listening to the story Captain Hawthorne had to tell, as if it was in love with itself.
"Oh,"
interrupted Doris with a sharp, pained cry.
"Do not, please do not. I never dreamed. I shall never go away from Uncle Winthrop. I do not want any other love. I thought it was... Betty, oh, forgive me for the pain and disappointment. I seem even to myself such a little girl."
But I can wait years. I wanted you to know. Oh, Doris, as the years go on, can you not learn to love me? I will be patient and live in the sweet, grand hope that some day...
No, no, do not hope. I cannot promise. Oh, you are so noble and upright. Can you not accept this truth from me? For it would only be pain and disappointment in the end.
No, she did not love him. Her sweet soul was still asleep within her fair body. He was too really honorable to persist.
Doris,
he said. What a sweet girl's name it was.
5 years from this time I shall come back. You will be a woman then. You are still a child. If no other lover has won you, I shall ask again.
He pressed her hand to his lips. Then he led her around to the porch and bade her a tender good night. He would not embarrass her by any longer stay. She ran up the steps. Cary intercepted her in the hall.
Has he gone? Doris?
Oh, did you know? How could you let him?
she cried in anguish.
How could you?
Doris, my dear little sister, he loved you so. But I wish it had been Betty. Oh, don't cry. You have done nothing. I'm sorry. But he would not have been satisfied if he had not spoken. He wanted to ask father first, but I hated to have him pained if it was not necessary.
Thank you for that, Cary. Do not tell him. You will not?
She pleaded, thinking of the other first.
No, dear. We must shield him. All we can.
Yes, they would try always. There was a little rift in the cloud of pain. The next evening Captain Hawthorne came over to bid them a formal goodbye. Helen Chapman and her lover and Eudora were there, so it was an unembarrassing affair with many good wishes on both sides. Doris thought she would like to run away and hide. It seemed as if the whole story was written in her face. Betty suspected, but she loved her too well to tease, and almost immediately Helen announced her arrangements. She was to be married in October. Doris and Cary must stand with her, and one of the Chapman cousins with Eudora. Another warm girlfriend and her lover would complete the party. Grandmamma had stipulated that Mr. Harrison Gray should cast in his lot with them for a year. Mr. Sargent had been attached to the embassy at London, and they would remain 2 years longer at least. Madame Royall could not bear to have the family shrink so rapidly. Betty was to go away again. Mr. and Mrs. Matthias King came together this time to see old friends in Boston, that Mr. King found wonderfully changed. He was to go to France on business for the firm of which he was a member, and be absent a year at least. It would be such a splendid chance for Betty. They were to take their own little Bessie and leave the 3 younger children with a friend who had a school for small people, and would give them a mother's care. There was a little grandson in Sudbury Street, and Mercy had proved a very agreeable daughter-in-law. Warren had begun to prosper again, and was full of hope. The children at Hollis Leverett's were growing rapidly. They no longer said "Little Sam." He was almost a young man. He had taken the Franklin Prize at the Latin School, and was now apprenticed to an architect and builder, and would set up for himself when he came of age, as Boston had begun to build up rapidly. But he couldn't help envying Cousin Cary Adams his prize money, and wondering what he meant to do with it. An invitation to go to Paris was not to be lightly declined then, any more than it would be now. Mrs. Manning did not see
how Betty could leave Mother for so long.
But Mrs. Leverett was in good health, and though she hated to have her go so far away, there really could be no objection, when Matthias King was so generous.
I am going to have some of my good times while we are together, and able to enjoy them,
he said to Mrs. Leverett.
I shall have to leave Electa alone every now and then while I'm about business, and it will be such a comfort to her to have Betty. No doubt we shall marry her to a French count.
Oh, no. Bring her back to me,
said Betty's mother. There was quite a stir among Betty's compeers. She was congratulated and envied, and they begged her to write everything she could about French fashions. How lucky that she had been studying French. Aunt Priscilla had a hard struggle with conscience after a matter that she felt to be quite a duty. Giving away finery that you would never wear was one thing, but your money was quite another.
Betty,
she said,
I'm going to make you a little gift. If you shouldn't want to use it, maybe Matt will see some way to invest it for you. When the trouble came to Warren, I said he might as well have his part as to wait until I'm dead and gone. I have been paid over and over again in comfort. He grows so much like your father, Betty, and he's weathered through the storm and stress. So, I'll do the same by you, and if you never get any more, you must be content.
It was an order for $500. Winthrop Adams would see it paid. Betty was quite overwhelmed.
I ought to give half of it to Mother,
she cried.
No. Your mother will have all she needs. Oh, the Mannings would borrow it of her to buy more ground with. I've no patience with all their scrimping. Sometimes I give thanks that poor Elizabeth is out of it all. Don't have an anxious thought about money where your mother is concerned.
What a comfort you are, Aunt Priscilla.
Well, it took years enough to teach me that anybody needed comforting.
As for Doris, she was so busy that she could hardly think about herself or Captain Hawthorne. She did wish he had not loved her. If she had known about the rose, her heart would have been still more sore and pitiful. Betty went before the wedding. They took a sloop to New York and were to leave there for Havre. Madame Royall had this wedding just to her fancy, and it was quite a fine affair. Cary looked very nice, Doris thought, for the sea tan had nearly all bleached out. His figure was compact, and he had a rather soldierly bearing. He was quite a hero, too, to his old college mates, some of whom had not considered him possessed of really strong characteristics. But the young ladies were proud of his notice and attention, and there was no end of invitations from their mothers when they were going to have evening companies. The cold weather came on apace. Mr. Adams seemed to feel it more, and gave up his horseback rides. He interested himself very much in the library plans, but he grew fonder of staying at home, and Doris was such a pleasant companion. Cary had never been fond of poetry, and now he threw himself into his profession with a resolve to stand high. Manhood's ambition was so different from the lukewarm endeavors of the boy. His father did enjoy his earnestness very much. Sometimes he roused himself to argue a point when 2 or 3 young men dropped in, and the old fire flashed up, although he liked best his ease and his poets, or Doris reading or singing some old song. But he did not lose his interest in the world's progress, or that of his beloved city. Doris was very happy in a young girl's way. One did not expect to fill every moment with pleasure, or to go to parties or the theatre every evening. There were other duties and purposes to life. As Aunt Priscilla did not go out after the cold weather set in, she ran up there nearly every day with some cheerful bit of gossip. Madame Royall had grown very fond of her as well. There was the dancing class and the sewing class, when they made garments for poor people, and shopping, even if one did not buy much, for now such pretty French and English goods were shown again. Then one stepped in the confectioner's on Newbury Street and had a cup of hot coffee or tea if it was a cold day, or strolled down Cornhill to see what new books had come over from London, for the Waverley novels had just begun, and everybody was wondering about the author. Or you went to Faneuil Hall to see Trumbull's Declaration of Independence, which was considered a very remarkable work. There were the sleigh rides, when you went out in style and had a supper and a dance, and the sledding parties, that were really the most fun of all, when you almost forgot you were grown up. Cary was always ready to attend his cousin, though she quite as often went out with Mr. and Mrs. Gray and Eudora. When he thought of it, it did seem a little curious that Doris had no special company. But a girl was not allowed to keep special company until the family had consented, and she was regularly engaged. Men, women, and girls came to sing, for a piano was a rarity. There were parties going on here and there, but Doris never evinced any particular preference. So spring came again, and gardening engrossed Doris. She had been learning housekeeping in all its branches under the experienced tuition of Miss Recompense and Dinah, a girl who did not know everything from the roasting of a turkey to the making of sack posset, and through all the gradations of pickling and preserving was not considered finished. Doris was very fond of the wide outdoors. She often took her work and Uncle Winthrop his book, and sat out on a rustic seat at the edge of the common, which was beginning to be beautiful, though it was 20 years later that the botanical garden was started. But now that our ships were going everywhere, curious bulbs and plants were brought from Holland and from the East Indies by sea captains, and they found wonderful wild flowers that developed under cultivation. Brookline was a great resort on pleasant days, with its meadows and wooded hillsides and beautiful gardens. Colonel Perkins had all manner of foreign fruits and flowers that he had brought home from abroad, and had a greenhouse where you could often find the grandmother of the family, who was most generous in her gifts. There were people who thought you flew in the face of Providence when you made flowers bloom in winter, but Providence seemed to smile on them. Over on the Foster estate at Cambridge there was a genuine hawthorn. People made pilgrimages to see it when it was white with bloom and diffusing its peculiar odor all about. There were the sweet blossoms of the mulberry and the honey locust, and the air everywhere was fragrant, for there were so few factories, and people had not learned to turn waste materials into every sort of product and make vile smells. Cary sometimes left his books early in the afternoon and went driving with them. If he did not appreciate poetry so much, he was on the lookout for every fine tree and curious flower, and 20 years later he was deep in the Horticultural Society. Uncle Winthrop bought a new low carriage this summer. For anyone else but a grave gentleman it would have looked rather pronounced, but it was so much easier to get in and out, and Doris in her sweet unconsciousness never made any bid for attention, but people would turn and look at them as one looks at a picture. 30 years or so afterward, old ladies would sometimes say to the daughters of Doris,
"My dear, I knew your mother when she was a sweet, fresh young girl, and used to go out driving with her uncle. Mr. Winthrop Adams was one of the high-bred, delicate-looking men that would have graced a court. There wasn't a prettier sight in Boston, and dear me, that was way back in 16 or 17. How time flies."
They heard from Betty occasionally. The letters were long and writ fine, though happily not crossed. They should have been saved for a book, they were so chatty. In August one came to Doris that stirred up a mighty excitement. Betty had a way of being quite dramatic and leading up to a climax. A month before they had met a delightful Frenchman, a Monsieur de la Mare, 25 or thereabouts, and found him an excellent cicerone to some remarkable things they had not seen. He was much interested in America and its chief cities, especially Boston, when he found that was Betty's native town. And one day he told them of a search he had been making for a little girl. The de la Mares had suffered considerably under the Napoleonic regime, and had now been restored to some of their rights. There was one estate that could not be settled until they found a missing member. They had traced the mother, who had died and left a husband and a little girl, Jacqueline.
"That is such a common name in France,"
explained Betty. She had been placed in a convent, and that was such a common occurrence, too. Then she had been taken to the north of England. He had gone to the old town, but the child's father had died, and some elderly relatives had passed away, and the child herself had been sent to the United States. Everybody who had known her was dead or had forgotten.
"And I never thought until one day he said Old Boston,"
confessed Betty.
"when I remembered suddenly that your mother's name was Jacqueline Marie de la Mare in the old marriage certificate. We had been talking of it a week or more, but one hears so many family stories here in Paris, and lost and found inheritances. But I almost screamed with surprise and added the sequel, and he was just overjoyed and brought the family papers. He and your mother are second and third cousins. It is queer you should have had so many far-off relations and so few nearby ones, and be mixed up in so many romances. The fortune sounds quite grand in francs, but if we enumerated our money by quarters of dollars, we might all be rich. It is a snug little sum, however, and they are anxious to get it settled before the next turn in the dynasty, lest it might be confiscated again. So Monsieur Henri is coming home with us, and we shall start the first day of September, as Mr. King has finished his business, and Electa is wild to see her children. I think I shall give talks all winter and invite you over to Sudbury Street with your sewing, for I never shall be talked out."
It was wonderful. Doris had to read the letter over and over. It had listeners at the Royall house who said it was a perfect romance, and at the Leveretts they rejoiced greatly.
"I declare,"
exclaimed Aunt Priscilla,
"if you should live to be 50 or 60, and everybody go on leaving your fortunes, you won't know what to do with your money. They're filling up the mill pond and the big marsh, and going to lay out streets. I wouldn't have believed it. Foss Leverett held on to his legacy because he couldn't sell it, and now Warren has been offered a good sum. Mary Manning will pinch herself blue to think she sold out when she did. I'm just glad for Warren. And Cary'll know so much law that he will look out for you."
It was a beautiful autumn, for a wonder. Summer seemed loath to depart or allow the flame-colored finger of fall to place her seal on the glowing foliage. But it was the last of October when Betty reached Boston, convoyed by a very old-time New England woman going on to Newburyport.
"For you know,"
said Betty,
"the French are very particular about a young woman traveling alone, but we did have a hunt to find someone coming to Boston." Otherwise, Monsieur Henri, you see how apt I am in French, could not have accompanied me.
Monsieur de la Mare was a very nice-looking young man, not as tall as Cary, but with a graceful and manly figure, soft dark eyes, and hair that just missed being black, a clear complexion and fine colour, and a small line of moustache. As to manners, he was really charming, and so well read that Mr. Winthrop Adams took to him at once. He was conversant with Voltaire and Rousseau, the plays of Racine and Molière, and the causes that had led to the French Revolution, and had been in Paris through the famous 100 Days. Of course, he was bitter against Napoleon. The inheritance part was soon settled. Doris would have about $3,000. But de la Mare took a great fancy to Boston, and the Royall family approved of him. Mr. and Mrs. Sargent had returned this fall, and the old house was a centre of attractive gaieties.
Do you know, I think Cousin Henri is in love with Betty,
said Doris, with a feminine habit of guessing at love matters.
But she insists she will never live abroad, and Cousin Henri thinks Paris is the centre of the world.
How will they manage?
Doris laughed. She did not just see herself. But Betty's romance came to light presently. It had begun during the winter in New York, but it had not run smoothly. Betty had a rather quick wit, and was fond of teasing, and there had been differences not easily settled. Mr. Harmon Gaynor had risen to the distinction of a partnership in the King firm, and on meeting Betty again, with the young Frenchman at her elbow, had presented his claim in such a way that Betty yielded. When Mr. Gaynor came to Boston to have a conference with Mrs. Leverett, for fathers and mothers still had authority in such matters, Betty's engagement was announced, and the marriage set for spring. Somehow it was a delightful winter, but after a little one person began to feel strongly apprehensive, and this was Cary Adams.
I suppose Doris and her third or fourth cousin will make a match?
Madame Royall said one evening when they had been playing Morris and she had won the rubber.
How can you let her go away?
She will never leave father,
exclaimed Cary confidently. There was a sudden stricture all over his body. It seemed as if some cold hand had clutched both heart and brain. He walked home in the bright, fresh air. It was barely 10. He passed de la Mare on his way, and they greeted each other. The parlor windows were darkened. His father was alone in the study, and everyone else had gone to bed.
"I wish you had been home,"
said his father, glancing up.
"De la Mare has been reciting Racine, and I have never heard anything finer. I wish you could read Shakespeare. He certainly is a delightful person, so cultured and appreciative. It makes me feel that we really are a new people."
Could no one see the danger? How happened it his father was so blind? Did Doris really care? She had not loved Captain Hawthorne, a man worthy of any woman's love. Cary had a confident feeling that in 5 years they would see him again, but he would be too old for Doris, 13 years between them. Yet his father had been 15 years older than his mother. Doris was so guileless, so simply honest, and if she loved, how curiously she had kept from friendships or intimacies with young men. Eudora had a train of admirers, so had Helen and Alice in their day. When he had met Mrs. Sargent, he knew it had only been a boyish fancy for Alice Royall, and it had merely shaped and strengthened the ardent desire of youth to go to his country's defence. He was a man now, and capable of loving with supreme tenderness and strength, yet he had seen no woman to whom he cared to pour out the first sweet draught of a man's regard. But Doris must not go away. She could not. Morning, noon, and night he watched her. She prepared his father's toast. She chatted with him and often coaxed him to taste this or that, for his appetite was slender. On sunny mornings they went to drive, or if not, she brought her sewing and sat in the study, listened and discussed the subjects he loved, and was enthusiastic about the Boston that was to be, that they both saw with the eye of faith. When he took his siesta, she ran up to Sudbury Street, or did an errand. Later in the afternoon there would be calls. There was a sideboard at the end of the hall where a bottle or two of wine was kept, as was the custom then, and a plate of cake. Doris brought in a fashion of offering tea, or sometimes mulled cider, on a cold day, but Miss Recompense made delicious tea, and some of the gentlemen took it just to see Doris drop in the lump of sugar so daintily. If they were at home, there was always company in the evening, unless the night was very stormy. De la Mare generally made one of the guests. If they were alone, they had a charming evening in the study. The young Frenchman was most punctilious. He might take a few cousinly freedoms, but he never offered any that were lover-like. So it was the more easy for Doris to persuade herself that it was merely relationship. Occasionally the eloquence of his eyes quite unnerved her. She cunningly sheltered herself beside Eudora when it was possible. But de la Mare's regard grew apace. It would not be honorable to come without declaring his intentions, and the American fashion of being engaged was extremely fascinating to him. He wanted the more than cousinly privileges. So it happened one night Betty and Warren came over with a piece of music Mrs. King had sent, a song by Moore, the Irish poet. Doris went to the parlor to try it. That was de la Mare's golden opportunity, and he could not allow it to slip. In a most deferential manner he laid his case before her relative and guardian, and begged permission to address Miss Doris. Winthrop Adams was utterly amazed at the first moment. Then he recovered himself. Doris was a young lady. One friend and another was being given in marriage, and Doris naturally would have lovers. There was one that he had hoped, but he had never seen any real indication.
It is true that I like my own Paris best, but if Miss Doris longed to stay here a few years, I would make myself content. But you will understand, I could not come any longer without explaining, and this time you allow young people, betrothment looks so attractive. May I ask and learn her sentiments, since young ladies choose for themselves?
What could he do but consent, if Doris should not love him?
Good night, Uncle Win,
cried Betty from the hall.
Good night, Monsieur de la Mare.
Doris was replacing some music in the portfolio. Cousin Henri crossed the room, and she saw a mysterious sweetness in his face as he took her hand.
Mes chers amis, Cousin Doris, I have just explained to your uncle my sentiments concerning you, and have his permission to ask for your regard. He loves you very dearly. Will you be my wife?
Doris drew her hand away and was pale and red by turns, while her throat constricted and her breath came in great bounds.
I am so sorry. I tried not to be. I did not want anything like this to happen, but sometimes I felt afraid.
She stammered in her embarrassment.
I like you very much, but I do not want to marry or to be engaged. I shall stay with my uncle. I shall never go away from the country of my adoption.
But if I were willing to remain a while, so long as your uncle lived, I do not wonder you love him very much. He is a charming gentleman. I have no parents to bid me stay at home. I need consult only you and myself.
Oh, no, no. Do not compel me to pain you by continued refusals. I cannot consent. I will always be friend and cousin. I do not love anyone.
Then if you do not love anyone, this friendship might ripen into a sweet regard. Oh, Doris, I had hardly thought so deep a love possible.
His imploring tone touched her, but she drew back farther and said in a more decisive tone,
Oh, no, no, I cannot promise.
He was too gentlemanly to persist in his pleading, but he was confident he had Mr. Adams on his side, and at home the desires of parents and guardians counted for a great deal.
My dear cousin, will you talk this matter over with your uncle? You may look at it in a different light, and I shall remain your ardent admirer until I am convinced. Since you have no lover...
Doris Adams suddenly straightened her pliant young figure. Some dignity was born in her face, and in the clear eyes she raised, too pure to doubt anything or to fear anything, sure for a moment that she possessed every pulse and thought and knowledge of her own soul, then beset by a strange shadowy misgiving that she had reached a curious crisis in her life that she did not know of an instant ago. But she said bravely, though there was a quiver in her breath that she tried to keep from her voice,
Let us remain cousins merely. My duty is here, my love is here also. To the best of fathers, the tenderest of friends. I cannot share it with anyone.
Delmar bowed and went slowly out of the apartment. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 24. The Bloom of Life, Love. Doris flew to the study. Uncle Winthrop's eyes were bent on his book, and his face partly turned aside. He had been making a brave fight. A man of a less fine strain of honor would not have answered the brave young lover as he had done. He could not have answered him thus if he had not liked Henri de l'Amour so well, and loved Doris with such singleness of heart. He heard her step and put out his hand without moving. His tone was very low.
Is it France?
France? Oh, Uncle Win, when I belonged to you in Boston?
Her arms were around his neck. His heart, his whole body seemed to give one great throb of joy as he drew her down to his knee. There had been only one other experience in life as sweet.
And you would have sent me away.
With a soft, broken-up rating in which love was uppermost.
No, child, no. God forbid, Doris. Now that you are not going, I will confess, I think I should have died before the parting came. But, my little girl, I must say this in memory of 2 sweet years of wedded life. There is no happiness comparable to it. And to accept your youth, your golden period that never dawns but once on any human being, to gladden my declining years would be a selfish sin. I once had a dream, but it came to naught.
He drew a long breath as if the remembrance pained him.
You must be quite free, dear, to love and to marry. All these years with you have been so precious, but some time I shall go my way, and I could not bear the thought of your being left alone.
I shall stay with you. There can never be any home like this, any love like yours.
The hall door opened and shut slowly. That was Cary's step. She could not meet him here. She kissed Uncle Win vehemently and flashed past the young man standing there almost in the doorway with a white, strained face. The great armchair was in her way, and she half stumbled over it. Then some other arms caught her, and she had no strength to struggle. Did she want to?
Doris, Doris, was it true what you said just now, that no home could be like this, and your love for him, which has been that of a tender daughter, his love for you? Is there room for another regard still? For Doris, I love you. I want you. I have been wild and jealous since I have suspected, since I have really known or guessed your cousin's intentions. I did not suspect at first. There were Betty and Eudora, and an old regard waiting for you. But now I can think of only one thing that has been in my mind day and night for the last fortnight, that I love you as well as the others. Only it seems a small and ignoble matter to appeal to your affection for my father and the old home. But I want your love, your sweetness, your precious faith, the trust of your coming womanhood, your own sweet self. I'm not a handsome fellow, like Captain Hawthorne, nor accomplished, like Delamar, but I shall love you to my life's end, Doris.
They sat down on the step of the old staircase, and he could feel the tremble in every pulse of her slim young figure. Was it the strange mystery that had come to her half an hour ago in the parlor opposite? A something that was not knowledge, but a vague consciousness that there was a person in the world who could say the words that would thrill her with delight instead of bring sorrow and regret.
All that is a very illogical and incoherent presentation. I must do better when I come to argue my first case.
And he gave a joyous little laugh, for he knew if Doris meant to say him nay, she would not let her head droop on his shoulder, or yield to the clasp of his arm. And suddenly his soul was filled with infinite pity for Hawthorne, and yes, he felt sorry for de l'Amour.
Doris, is it a little for my own sake?
A breath of happy content swept over her like a summer wind coming from some mysterious world.
You have been an angel of comfort to both of us. I don't know what I should have done in that unhappy time if it had not been for you, but Hawthorne's regard made it a point of honor for me. Could you have loved him, Doris? He is such a fine fellow.
He noted the little shrinking. He was holding her so close.
Not in that way.
And her reply was a soft whisper.
Thank heaven! But I want to hear you say, oh, my darling, I want the assurance that I shall be dear to you, that it is not all because
I should stay for Uncle Win's sake, and I think Miss Recompense finds a great many sources of happiness in a single life. But if I promised you, it would be because I loved you.
Then promise me,
he cried, enraptured.
I love you dearly, if I haven't been much of a lover. I have said to myself that I was waiting for Hawthorne's 5 years to end, or to do something worthy of you. And now, Doris, I know what fighting means, and I would fight to the death for you. I am afraid I shall be selfish and exigent to the last degree.
He felt the delicate revelation in the warmth of her cheek, the tremble of the soft hands, the relaxation of her whole body, and a kind of solemn exultation filled his soul. Except the youthful episode with Alice Royall, he had never sincerely cared for any woman, and he was very glad he could give Doris the first offering of a man's love as he understood it now. And then for a long while neither spoke, except in kisses, love's own language. Every moment the mystery seemed to grow upon Doris, to unfold as well, to pass the line of girlhood, to accept the crown of a woman's life. It had been very simply sweet. Some other woman might have made a rather tragic episode of her two lovers. Doris pitied them sincerely, but they both had the deepest sympathy from Cary Adams.
Let us go to him,
Cary exclaimed presently, rising with his arm still about her. There were 2 wax candles burning in their sconces that had been made over 40 years ago in Paul Revere's foundry. By the softened light, Cary glanced at the flushed face, downcast eyes, and dewy, tremulous lips. Half the sweet story was still untold, but there would be years and years. Oh, heaven grant that they might have them together. And at this instant he was filled with a profound sympathy for his father's loss and lonely life. They walked slowly through the hall and paused a moment in the doorway. Winthrop Adams was leaning his head on his hand, and the lamp a little at the side threw up his thin, finely cut features, as if they had been done in marble, and he was almost as pale. The exultation went out of the soul of the young lover, and a rush of tenderness such as he had never experienced before swept through him.
Father,
he said softly, touching him on the shoulder.
Father, will you give me Doris, for your claim is first? Will you accept me as her lover, sometime to be her husband, always to be your son and your daughter?
Winthrop Adams rose half bewildered. Had the secret hope of his soul unfolded in blessed fruition? He looked from one to the other, then his glance rested on his son. Their eyes met, and in that instant they came to know each other as they never had before, to understand, to comprehend all that was in the tie of nature. He laid one hand on his son's shoulder. The other clasped the slim, virginal figure, no longer a little girl, but whose girlhood and affectionate devotion would always fill both hearts.
Doris, my child, you are quite sure?
He could not have his son defrauded of any sweetness. Doris raised her downcast eyes and smiled, while the pink flush was like a rosy gleam of sunshine. Then she laid her hand over both of the others in a tender, caressing fashion, but she was too deeply moved for words. Winthrop Adams kissed her fair brow, but her lover kissed her on the sweet, rosy lips. They announced the engagement almost at once. It was done partly for de l'Amour's sake, though after the first he took it quite philosophically. There were 3 people supremely happy over it: Miss Recompense, Madame Royall, who declared she would have been disappointed in Providence if it had been any other way, and Cousin Betty, who was happy as a queen in her own life, though why we should make royalty a synonym for happiness I do not know.
You never could have left Uncle Win,
wrote Betty.
And Cary could not have gone away, neither could he have brought home a strange woman. This was the only satisfactory ending, but I hope you will be awfully in love with each other, and sweet, and silly, and all that. I am sorry for Captain Hawthorne. For Doris, he loved you sincerely, but your French cousin can console himself with an English rhyme. If she be not fair for me, what care I how fair she be?
And oddly enough, a few months later he did console himself with Eudora Chapman. Just a few years after, there was a great time in Boston, for she had adopted a charter and become a real city. After long and earnest discussion, there was a grand celebration and no end of dinners, and young Cary Adams made one of the addresses. Mr. Winthrop Adams insisted that his life work was done, but he lived to be interested in many more improvements and some charming grandchildren.
But after all,
Doris would declare,
splendid as it is going to be, I am glad to belong to old Boston, with their lanes and byways and rough hills and marshlands, with their billowy grasses and wildflowers, and great gardens full of fruit trees, and the little old shops, and people sitting on front stoops, sewing or reading or chatting cozily. And what a pleasure it will be by and by to tell the children that I was a little girl in old Boston.
The end. End of chapter 24. End of A Little Girl in Old Boston by Amanda Minnie Douglas.